All right, good morning. Good morning to everyone here as well as those online. Um, and welcome to the Resources to Impact Research Symposium this morning. This symposium is hosted by all the COBRES here at Brown University Health Institutions. And we're very fortunate to have several COBRES within our institutions. And all of them have the same mission, and that's to help early career investigators move forward and advance and become independent funded researchers. And although our topics vary and what we're doing research in, I think that goal is universal. And hopefully programs like this help our early career faculty and move them forward. But they just don't magically happen. They happen through the diligent work of our COBRE administrators. And I want to thank them for putting this program together. They are kind of the fuel of the engines of COBREs, not just for conferences, but for really their daily work. And, my administrator in the injury control COBRE, Julie Bromberg, Susan Bombardier, Tricia Meehan, Crystal Medeiros, Caitlin Borber, and Maggie Walsh. Thank you all for your efforts in putting this together. I really didn't introduce myself. I'm Mike Mello. I'm the principal investigator in the injury control COBRE here at Rhode Island Hospital. I'm a professor of emergency medicine at the med school, as well as professor of health services policy and practice at the School of Public Health. I think we'll just get started with the program. Our first speaker, I understand, is going to be joining us online. Couldn't be here in person. Are they online and ready? Great. So our first speaker is Heather Spellman from Birdie, which is here at Rhode Island Hospital. She's going to be talking with us about data planning and the stewardship program that they have here at Rhode Island Hospital and accessing data and sharing data. Heather, you there?
Yes. Hello. Good morning. I'm just going to pull up my presentation. Oh, perfect. I share my screen so I can click through. Okay.
Heather, do you want to just tell me when to advance your slides? I have them here.
Sure. Or I just shared my screen, so I think I can do it on my end.
Okay.
As well, but let me just make sure. Can everyone see my screen?
Yep. Yeah.
Okay. Just want to make sure. Okay, good morning, everyone. So some of you know me. For those who do not, my name is Heather Spellman. I am a research data manager here at Brown Health on the Biostatistics, Epidemiology, Research Design, and Informatics Core, better known as Birdie, and I lead the Data Planning and Stewardship Program. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the program, the data sharing process, some best practices, considerations, and share some resources with you as well. So the major teams involved are Birdie, Grants and Contracts, HRPP, and IS Research Computing. And we also, as needed, consult with corporate compliance, risk management, and legal. Current practice is all outgoing research data or reciprocal data sharing that includes data that's leaving the institution requires a data transfer and use agreement, regardless of data type. So this includes fully de-identified data as well. All incoming data follows the requirements of the provider, so it's at the discretion of your collaborator whether they will require one to be in place if we're the recipient. The one thing I'll say is if we are receiving any identifiable data, chances are they will require one. All data sharing currently related to research comes through the DPSP. The only exception to this is fully industry-sponsored research, which is managed by the Clinical Trial Office. We hope one day to integrate that into DPSP, but right now we just don't have the bandwidth, and most industry-sponsored research is covered by clinical trial agreements. If it's a combination and there's federal funding involved, it will come through us. So we consult with researchers, create a data management and sharing plan or help them edit one, provide guidance, determine the need for a DTUA, help prepare, edit, review the DTUA for completeness and accuracy, review IRB documentation for the same and also consistency, collaborate with the teams above, and document and track outcomes. So the objectives and approach, comprehensive planning as early as possible. This is number one. In a perfect world, we would love to be able to meet with researchers before you've even submitted to the IRB, but we know that's not always possible. But when it is, it's great because we can help you ensure that your data sharing agreement and your IRB are in sync and everything is, all your ducks are in a row. Ensure consistency between your IRB approved protocol, consent, if applicable, DTUA, and institutional capabilities, policies, and practices. Integrated review and collaboration, support, educate, and advocate for the research community, learn and adapt, and enhance compliance tracking and documentation. So this is just kind of an example of some of the data sharing agreements you can see. There are a lot more that are not on here, lots of different acronyms. Most commonly is the DTUA or a DUA. You have a one-way data sharing agreement, reciprocal, or a collaborative, which are include multi-party. Subawards, we really have tried to steer away from this. So there are subawards that have a data sharing component in them. We try to remove that if at all possible, because when data sharing is tied to a subaward, it can delay funding, and that's the last thing that we want. So if the collaborator is amenable, we try to remove that and proceed with a separate DTUA. And if we're unable to do that, then we expedite these so that funding is not delayed. Clinical trial agreements here, I'm specifically talking to federal funded ones. MOUs, PSAs, we mostly review to assess the need for a DTUA. We have data use and material transfer agreement. That's a combination agreement. And then we have your NIMH data archives forms. The DSA allows you to upload your data to a public repository, and the DUC allows you to remove data to use from a public repository. So I'm going to focus on the DTUA because that's the most common. A lot of the components are comparable in these data sharing agreements in general, but we'll focus on the DTUA. They are project specific and they're detailed. They are between an entity of Brown University Health and usually a contractor, private industry, academic institution, or government or state agency. The data provider generally dictates the template that's used, but not always. We at Brown Health prefer the use of the Federal Demonstration Partnership template, or the FDP template. And the reason for that is it's widely accepted and standardized, and it decreases negotiations and administrative burden. Collaborators, however, may have their own internal requirements and request the use of their own template. Instances of that would be international sites and state agencies. External templates, they're okay. They just may prolong the review process as they often require additional red lines and negotiations. And one thing I just want to mention are some considerations for international collaborations. So if you are planning to collaborate with an international site, one thing to keep in mind regarding data sharing is that we can't always adhere to their foreign compliance requirements and privacy laws. And an example of this would be the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, which is a European Union law. We can only accept data that is not regulated by GDPR. So it has to be fully anonymized per their standards, not pseudonymized. Pseudonymized per GDPR is comparable to coded data here in the US, and it is looked at as fully identifiable and subject to their standard contractual clauses, which we cannot be a party to. So just a consideration with international sites that there may be hiccups when it comes to agreements and their requirements and laws. So I'm going to quickly go over the components of the DTUA. And again, we'll use the FDP template just because that's the one we use here. You have the provider and recipient info, which is, it must be the entity listed. So not Brown Health, it has to be Rhode Island, Bradley, Miriam, et cetera. The scientist, provider, or recipient should be the main PI, not a co-I, and also not a student. So if you have a student receiving data or providing the data, it should be the faculty member or a mentor that's listed on this agreement. All of that staff, so co-Is, students, residents, et cetera, they're all covered under provider and recipient personnel, which is actually outlined in the terms and conditions. So they also have access to this data per the agreement, but it should be the main PI or faculty or mentor that's listed. Project title should match your IRB or grant. Agreement term is when the data must be returned or destroyed. Data type, de-identified, limited, or identifiable. The terms and conditions are standardized in the FDP, as I mentioned, which is great. They can't be edited. They can't be removed. If they were, we'd have to remove the FDP moniker in that case, but that's why we like this template. Signature page, you don't have to worry about. We take care of that. This is just a screenshot of the next components I'll talk about, project-specific information. So attachment 1, description of data, we're looking for the data type. We always ask for in our review a comprehensive list of data fields to be transferred. That can be in the form of a codebook, data dictionary, or actually just listing out these data fields in the agreement. Who will gather the data? How will they gather it? And from where? What are the methods for de-identification if applicable? If you're transferring PHI or PII, which of the 18 identifiers will be included? And usually in this section, we note the name of the study the data was obtained under and the IRB net ID. Description of project is self-explanatory, the scope of work, how will the data be used by the recipient. Data transmission, you'll have the contact information of the recipient scientist and details regarding mechanism of transfer and storage and security. Disposition requirements, how long will the recipient be permitted to use the data? What will happen after that time? One thing to consider here are public access requirements. So that pertains to NIH public data sharing. That will not be impacted by the disposition requirement. So it's good to put a little blurb in there if there are public access requirements. Attachment 2, which is generally inserted by grants and contracts, are data-specific terms and conditions specific to the data type. And then the last section is collaborator personnel. So will there be any collaborator personnel or third parties permitted to access your data? This does not, again, include provider or recipient personnel. It's anybody outside of the 2 parties listed in this agreement. Again, a couple screenshots of those sections for you. Attachment 2, the data-specific terms and the collaborator personnel. Some HRPP considerations and resources. So a big part of our review includes going through thoroughly through IRB net, soon to be Huron, and all of your IRB documentation. So we're looking for consistency between the consent protocol and your data sharing agreement. Main elements we're looking for in the IRB: where are the data going? What is the data type? What's the mechanism of transfer, storage, security, information, and noting that a DTUA will be executed prior to transfer. Other considerations: the number of transfers. Is this an ongoing transfer? Is it a one-time transfer? The method of obtaining data. Is it an IS data extract, manual chart abstraction, and your process for de-identification if applicable. There is a link here to schedule a consult with Allie Jean and or Claire Walker if necessary. We have a lot of combo consults with them to streamline communication and ensure everybody's on the same page. And then while we're talking about HRPP considerations, one big question I get from researchers is, I have consented research, the participants consented, why do I need a DTUA if they're consenting? And I just wanted to quickly discuss the difference between permission pathway versus Brown Health's DTUA requirements, which is separate from HIPAA's DUA requirements related to a limited data set. But the informed consent allows or gives permission to share. The data use agreement governs a lot more than that, as you can see here. It defines the parties, the data type and description, terms and conditions, scope of work, costs and reimbursements, privacy and confidentiality, ownership, publications, safeguards and notifications, data security, permitted use and restrictions, intellectual property, disposition requirements, and liability provisions. So it's really important to have both of those in place to protect the data. And one thing to note here too, another big question I get is I am not sending EHR data. No EHR data is being transmitted, but all data that is created by our researchers and our research here at Brown Health belongs to Brown University Health unless otherwise specified. Some IS considerations. So one thing I'll mention is regardless of the need for a DTUA, so for instance, let's say you are the recipient of the data only and your collaborator does not require a DTUA, I still want you to think about the IS component of this, so mechanism of transfer, storage, and security, because that's still important. File size and data type will determine those. There's different mechanisms and storage that you're going to use depending on the size and the type. Study applications generally also have an ancillary review by IS. The preferred mechanisms of transfer by IS are encrypted email if it's under 50 gigs and secure file transfer protocol or SFTP if it's over 50 gigs, or if you have ongoing transfers, it's also preferred. Some helpful links here: IS consultation request, the SFTP request, data storage and sharing pages on the internet. And then another important one is the unblock website request. This is specific to cloud share repositories, which I'll talk about on another slide. Another thing I wanted to mention is biospecimen data considerations. So this is something that has actually come up recently that we're trying to manage, and that is data associated with specimens. So oftentimes the data associated with specimens is not covered in an MTA. An MTA only covers the material transfer only. Unless it is a combination agreement, as I mentioned, there are those data use and material transfer agreements. And when we're talking about data, it can be either data on the actual tube itself or specimen itself on the label, an accompanying manifest, or associated clinical data. And while we're talking about this, I wanted to also mention dates, because that's one of the biggest things we see with researchers who come to us and say, I plan to share a completely de-identified data set, and come to find out dates are included. So dates constitute a limited data set. And it's not just date of birth or date of death, et cetera. It's all dates that are directly tied to an individual, all elements of date that are smaller than a year. So a lot of times biospecimens do have date, at least date of collection. They may even have date of birth on them, age, et cetera. So that data needs to be covered, and MTAs do not currently come through DPSP. We're hoping, again, similar to industry, to incorporate that in at some point, but we haven't yet. We do handle the data component, however. So one thing is, if you know you're sharing samples, it's good to come through us so we can review all applicable agreements. Sometimes it can be covered in a collaboration agreement, a service agreement. We will look through those and see and ensure that it is covered. Consider the necessity for a BAA depending on the vendor and the service they're providing. And if it isn't covered in one of those agreements, we will begin the DTUA process to cover the data associated with specimens. Some other considerations, common questions and kind of topics that come up. Free text fields and notes are inherently identifiable, and the reason for that is they are not discrete fields, so you can enter anything into them. I kind of look at it in two different categories. You have your AI, natural language processing, and machine learning category, which I'm trying to advocate right now for the research community, because currently right now, it's a hard no to send that data outside of the institution, because it's a large amount of notes fields that are included in that. And then you have your other free text fields, like in a REDCap project, for instance, whether it's a multiple choice and then an other field, or describe your symptoms, et cetera. If, depending on the participants and the records, and the study staff, if it is reasonable for the study staff to go through and review those, it's a case-by-case basis, but we can add an attestation in the DTUA noting that they will be reviewed by the study staff. If you're trying to send a fully de-identified data set, is what this pertains to. Imaging data is another big one that we see and have been handling, specifically neuroimaging data, but DICOMs, we're going to be looking at de-identification and defacing if it's neuroimaging, and DICOMs just in general for all other imaging. Data can hide in numerous places with imaging data, so file names, metadata, editable text, and burned-in text. So it's important that those get thoroughly reviewed. Right now, for neuroimaging data, de-identification can be done by the file room, and also Scott Collins is performing the defacing work. We do have some new software that we're testing, which would be great if it ends up working out and can be utilized in the community. Coded data and documentation. So just a note on this, we need to make sure there's an attestation in the DTUA, which the FDB template, it's baked into those data specific terms usually, but if it's an external template, we need to be sure that we are attesting to the fact that the key is staying here at Brown Health and it is not being shared with the collaborator. Cloud share repositories, which I touched on earlier. So these are your Dropbox, Box, Google Drive, Amazon S3, et cetera. There's a bunch of them. Most of those require an IS review and approval, which was that website unblock link I had earlier. The one thing to note about these, particularly if PHI is being shared, it's a one-time use, so it's project specific. So if you submit a ticket to IS and you're approved to use Google Drive for that particular project, and you decide you want to use it for another one, you need to submit another ticket for IS to review, because they may approve a ticket for you to share de-identified data, and now you're going to be sharing PHI for a separate project. So that's important. Video and audio recordings and transcription. It's another thing that comes up. Audio recordings are kind of the fuzzy area of, are they identifiable? Are they not? Again, it depends on how many recordings we're talking about. How long are the recordings? Is a transcription service being used? Are the recordings being sent, or just the transcriptions? Can the study staff feasibly go through and ensure no identifiers have been spoken in an audio recording? PHI and PII to non-covered entities. This is something that comes through our larger group for review, particularly if it is a waiver of consent or authorization. We actually ask for an institutional statement regarding how they protect our data and safeguard the PHI. If it is being sent to a non-covered entity, that's again a case-by-case basis for a waiver. And then public access requirements I discussed with NIH. So one of the million-dollar question is, how long will this take? How long will this review take in total? And it's a really tough one to answer, but I'll quickly discuss kind of the factors that impact speed. The one thing I'll say is it's just myself and my colleague Evelyn Namaja who are doing these reviews. We certainly need help and hoping to have that in the future. But Evelyn was actually temporarily came on to help with DPSP to try to cut through the backlog. When I inherited this last year, we had a huge backlog that we inherited, and we've only had a steady stream of submissions since. And we have unfortunately been unable to get through that backlog. But a couple different factors that impact speed: knowledge and experience of the PI and study team, the data management and sharing plan. Is the plan clear? Is the information readily accessible? That's usually not the case. The size of our queue, your place in the queue, and our backlog, as I mentioned. The actual review itself and the time that takes. So validating those details, ensuring consistency between your DTUA, IRB, and your plan, peeling back those layers, delays between iterations of back and forth, which I try to eliminate. So if there's any editing that needs to be done to the DTUA, I'll do that myself as to avoid any back and forth. Changes to the plan and new questions or issues that may arise. IRB approval and or revisions and IS approval. So are there details or documents missing? Has there been a change in data type or plan? Any details related to mechanism of transfer and storage? Are there Avanti tickets outstanding that require approval? Scheduling and bandwidth. And then lastly, red lines, negotiations, and signatures. That process is variable. I will say Grants and Contracts does a fantastic job of getting these out the door when we send them to them. And then when they get to the other institution, it's really in their hands at that point. It could be days, weeks, months that it takes them to sign. I'd say most commonly it's in the weeks range, but it just depends on the external institution. One thing I'll note here is we prioritize submissions with time constraints within reason. So I don't know what I don't know. Please tell me if you have a deadline or a time constraint, because we do everything we can to prioritize that to get it done for you. The goal is to eliminate any delays in funding and support participation in research. And again, like I said, within reason. If you come to me and say you need it done in 2 weeks, I don't know that that's necessarily going to be feasible. That's why the earlier you come to us, the better. But we do everything we can. This is just a little screenshot of our dashboard. This actually takes data from our database, kind of just gives a little overview of how many we have churning, how many are out for execution, how many reviews are in process, some that we haven't even touched, et cetera, and then how many executions we have per month. And then lastly, what are the steps? So you know you need to share your data. What do you do? So the step 1 is completing our DPSP submission form. It's our REDCap survey. You can either, when you get to the landing page, you can either decide to book a consultation with us from there or complete the form and enter the queue if you've done this before or you're confident. There's a helpful guide on there as well on the landing page, and I encourage using that. And I actually want to edit it with some of the information in this presentation as well. Same thing with the REDCap survey. I'm trying to kind of revamp that to make it easier for researchers. Steps 2 and 3, so the internal review process. Right now, we're giving an approximate 4 to 6 week timeline from submission to the beginning of our review. However, we are backlogged, and I think that's a little bit longer than I'd like it to be, unfortunately, right now, but we're trying our best. Birdie conducts the initial review and collaborates with our larger group. Concordance with IRB protocol, consent, consultation. We coordinate ancillary reviews and solutions. We validate fields for level of de-identification, document, track, and help edit the DTUA. Revisions are often required to the data management and sharing plan, the DTUA, and IRB documents to meet regulatory or institutional standards. Once the draft of your data sharing agreement is good to go, Birdie will send that final draft to Grants and Contracts, CC the PI and study contact if applicable, and then red lines and negotiations will occur as necessary, and they will route for signatures from the PIs and authorized officials at both institutions. And then lastly, you have your receipt of your fully executed agreement, which will give you the green light to send the data. In addition to full IRB approval, one thing I'll mention here is they can happen in parallel. So you don't need to have IRB approval before we will process your DTUA. We can do them at the same time, provided all details are consistent between both. That way one's not holding up the other. Lastly, here is just a resource page. So again, our REDCap survey, our submission form, our booking link, separate from the REDCap. If you want to book with us, any questions can be directed to myself or Evelyn. BAAs, if you need information on that, the BAA email is here, as well as the report, which will list all the vendors that have an executed BAA in place currently. Our Birdie website, the FDP DTUA resources, and the HHS guidance regarding de-identification. And because we work so closely with Brown University, I also have their emails here as well. All three of these emails go to the same inbox related to data sharing and MTAs. And then lastly, we will do a little Q&A if anyone has any questions, and I will do my best to answer them. And if I don't have the answer, I will find it for you, do my best to find it for you.
Thanks, Heather. Yeah, there was a lot there. There's probably some questions either from folks in the room or folks online. If you're online, you could either type a question in the chat or raise your hand. I can't see either, but the people in the room on computers who can. So just please, and I assume these slides we have and will make available to everyone who's registered. There's a lot of good resources there that with the people.
And we're happy to meet too. So like I said, consult to discuss, your actual plan, or even if you just have more questions about the process, please schedule with us, email us, happy to answer any of your questions.
And what is the timeline for that? So if I say, yes, I'm planning on a project and I want to chat for a consultation, is that weeks, is that months, or how soon can I kind of start the process with consulting with you or wherever?
Like how soon can you get a consult? Is that the question?
Yeah.
With us, pretty like as soon as possible. So my booking link is linked to my team's calendar. So there's this week, for instance, would be booked, but there should be availability for next week. So as soon as the following week, and honestly, if for some reason in my booking link, if it's booked up and you need to talk sooner, just email me and I can make time in my schedule to meet with you.
Great, thank you. Other questions?
Are there any examples of DTUAs or DUAs with the type of language that you're looking for that we can access?
So like one that's already been done?
Yeah.
So there's not one, we can't really share because these are legal contracts that are done between two different parties. So we can't really give one that's already been done. If you know a colleague who's already done this and they'd want to share it with you, you can ask them for that. But my guide, so the helpful guide that I have on that landing page will actually, like I did in this presentation, walk you through exactly what we look for in each one of those sections in the FDP template. So it'll have everything you're looking for. That, and like I said, I'm also happy to meet with you and we can open up the FDP template and I'll walk you through each step as well. The one thing I'll tell you is if you take a stab at it and you submit it to me, like I mentioned, if it needs editing, things are in the wrong spot, or if it's missing information, I will do that for you at that point. Once you've submitted it to me, I will kind of do all the editing work on the back end that needs to be done.
The question. Anything online? No. All right, well, great. We'll hear from the folks in the room. We appreciate you giving us all that information.
Absolutely, thank you.
Oh, I think we've got one question that just came up.
Actually, it seems like a question did pop up in the chat.
Can you explain a bit more about the need for a D2A for de-identified data or data that is made publicly available?
Yep, so right now, and this is something I'm actually working on, we do require DTUAs for completely de-identified data, and that is an institutional policy that we have that I'm actually trying to eliminate the need for. We will still, if we are able to get rid of the need to do a DTUA for completely de-identified data, we still will validate the fields for de-identification, but then hopefully we won't need to proceed with the actual agreement. That's something we're in talks with Barat and compliance and legal to see if that's an option. As far as data that's made publicly available, so that's what I was talking about, public access requirements. If there's any component where you're sharing this data, which as we know with NIH, it's a requirement, that data is not subject to the DTUA. So if you know that in your project, you're going to have to share data for NIH or what have you, there's a section in the disposition requirements and in the description of project where you'll speak to those public access requirements, and that data can be shared as needed publicly.
All right, well, thank you very much, Heather. I think we'll go on. Our next speaker is also going to join us online. We'll actually have people in the room soon, but it just worked out this way. Our next speaker is Andrew Creamer from Brown. He's going to be speaking to us about creating an NIH biographical sketch and current and pending documents using Science NCV. I'm not sure what that is, but Andrew spoke to us last year, and then he actually came to our COBRE and did a meeting with us. I always learn things when he comes talk with us. He always tells us about something that the Brown Library has that I didn't know about that is very helpful. So I'm sure today will be no different, and it'll be a very informative talk. Andrew?
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Mello, for the introduction. I'm happy to present today on some updates coming for biographical sketches and current and pending support documents that will be happening after the spring of this year. And I have, in case folks forget me today, there's a public access at Brown email where folks tend to reach out to us for questions about public access compliance for NIH. And so you can jot that one down. In terms of the forms, so the federal agencies are adopting common forms for the biographical sketches or biosketches and current and pending support documents. And so the good news is if you've written a National Science Foundation grant proposal within the last year, you have used these forms, and it's been great because we've had colleagues at Brown University Health and the university who have gotten to kick the tires on using these forms and using the platform ScienceCV that will be required to generate these forms. So we're a little bit more confident going into the spring with these updates because we've had some practice with NSF. But the biggest idea that we want to get across is that sort of the fillable PDF for your biosketch is going to go away. And if you have a template that you use for your biosketches, we're going to have to collaborate with you and cooperate to update those to these new forms. And then once that's, we've onboarded people to ScienceCV, we're happy to keep collaborating with folks to create a new template that you can then use for future, repeatedly for future proposals for biosketches and current and pending support documents. So the timing is important. So the forms before May 24th we'll be using the standard biographical sketch that NIH makes available, but the new forms will come into required use on May 25th. So I'm sort of preparing people now so that if you have time this summer, as you're working on a grant proposal, that you might want to reach out in the same way we did with NSF last year, where we had PIs at the hospital and the university who were just interested in updating their biosketch so that it was ready to go for their next grant proposals. So we still have some time, so I really appreciate today getting the word out. And I like that, the federal government has this page about what we can do. One is doing training on this platform, ScienceCV, that I'm doing today. And the other requirement that's unique is that ORCID, which is not a government system, it's a not-for-profit, but all PIs are going to be required to have an ORCID ID and link it to their ScienceCV profile so that it appears on your biographical sketch and your current and pending support documents. So today's presentation is going to be focused on ScienceCV, but I also do help people get ORCID profile set up. And so I'll be available again this summer to help folks as needed to link your ORCID with your ScienceCV. But ScienceCV is a federal agency platform. ORCID is not, but the government is requiring folks to get an ORCID ID if you don't have one and link it to your biographical sketch and current and pending support document. So just to recap what's new, there's new forms. We're going to have these required after May, at the end of May. There's also some additional changes, things that folks are not perhaps used to, which is now you're going to be required to sign and certify that the information within the biographical sketches and the current and pending support documents are correct. And as administrative support staff, we cannot do this for investigators. So we are still delegates. You can still delegate to us to create the biosketch and to fill out a current and pending support document. But PIs, this is a new step where you're going to be required to actually download it and sort of certify that all of the information is correct. The other big change again is the required use of this platform. So the fillable PDF will be phased out, and that PIs are going to be required to have an ORCID ID and required to link it to their ScienceCV account so that it appears on these documents. Where we're helping folks and what we've been doing for NSF over the last year is just helping PIs and support administrative staff set up ScienceCV accounts, and then add support staff as needed to be delegates on your account so that we can help you to populate biosketches and current and pending support documents. And so we're helping PIs set up ScienceCV accounts. We're also helping folks set up ORCID accounts because, again, the ORCID is required, even though it's a separate system. So we're kind of helping folks do both of these this summer and hope that folks will reach out to us to get help in obtaining and setting up ORCIDs as well. So let's go back to ScienceCV. So the big question at the beginning was, well, what is ScienceCV? So ScienceCV is a government platform that's available through MyNCBI. So the good thing about NIH, having this after NSF is that for NSF folks, they were not really aware of what MyNCBI is or NCBI, so that was a learning curve. And for this population, the good news is you're already familiar with MyNCBI. You use it for your MyBibliography. So ScienceCV is in the same dashboard, so we activate it within the same space, which is great. It's going to be used to required use in creating biosketches and current and pending support documents. So importing citations into your biosketch will only happen through importation through MyBibliography and/or ORCID. And so that's one of the reasons we've been helping folks on the ORCID side, especially in the physical sciences with the NSF, because there's no longer a fillable PDF where you can sort of import this. It has to be done from one of these two systems. And then helping folks work through this sort of electronic certification process. So let's get started. So as I mentioned before, ScienceCV is available through MyNCBI. So you log in, luckily, in the same way that you've been logging in to access your MyBibliography, which is great. And so if what we are telling people, though, is to make sure that you're consistent with the way that you choose to log in to your MyNCBI MyBibliography, if that's login.gov, hopefully, or if it's your ERA Commons account that you choose to use to log in, because one of our largest issues we've had over the last year is that folks log in once with one ID and then they establish a ScienceCV account and then they log in a second time with a different ID that they have, and then it creates a duplicate account. So you end up with two accounts, and then you might draft a biosketch or a current and pending support document that you want a support staff to help fill out, and then we can't find it because we're in a different account than the one that you originally created. And so the good news is we can link existing accounts, so it's not the end of the world. It might slow us down a little bit, but we can merge those accounts with the help desk, which is great. And as I mentioned, since the folks in this room are familiar with MyNCBI and accessing your MyBibliography account, ScienceCV, once you activate it, it's hidden on your in the bento boxes of your dashboard way at the bottom, which is not very helpful. But the good thing about these bento boxes, you might have found that you can move them around, so you can actually move it up to the top And you can remove some of these bento boxes if they're not relevant for your work. And so hopefully you already have a My Bibliography account. If you have trainees who do not have a My Bibliography account, we want them to activate that first before activating their Science CV. And the reason is we need to be able to access My Bibliography from Science CV. So if My Bibliography isn't activated first, then we won't be able to pull those publications in, and we have to call the help desk and kind of fix that order of operations. And so for PIs, that's not going to be an issue, but for folks new and haven't set up a My Bibliography before, this is something that we're trying to get the word out about, that sort of order of operations. And then the next step, as I mentioned before, is this requirement to add your ORCID ID to and link that to your MyNCBI and your ScienceCV account. And that happens within what they call the mini profile. So once you activate your ScienceCV within your dashboard on MyNCBI, you'll see this sort of mini profile that you can edit. And you'll notice that it asks you for an ORCID ID. And again, NIH, the forms will be updated at the end of May. So this is the one for NSF. So imagine that it says ERA Commons instead of NSF ID, but you can see there's a place now where it asks you to add your ORCID identifier. And then once you set up that profile, anytime in the future when you come back to your dashboard to activate your or to access your Science CV, you just click Manage Science CV, and that's where you would go to go and create your biosketch and your current and pending support document. So linking delegate access is the same, luckily, as adding a delegate to your MyNCBI account. So you always click on your name in the upper right-hand corner and click on account settings. And within account settings, you can type in ORCID, and then it will take you to your ORCID account, and then you'll log into ORCID and authenticate, and then it will automatically add that ID to your MyNCBI account. So this is my MyNCBI. So you can see here, I have linked it to Brown and I've linked it to ORCID. And so for trainees, we also link them to their ERA Commons account and any other, like if they're affiliated with Brown, we link them with Brown or login.gov as folks need. And so adding a delegate, same thing as adding it to My Bibliography, which is great. So in account settings, scroll down to delegates, add in delegate. You need to put in our email address for administrative staff so that we can get an invite to be able to access your My Bibliography and Science CV. And then what you will see is all of the administrative support staff that you've added to your My Bibliography and Science CV. And you just want to ensure that there's a check mark in both of those boxes so that we can add papers to your My Bibliography, and we can also generate biographical sketches and current and pending support documents. If that's unchecked, then I won't be able to access our administrative staff within your department who helps with grant support won't be able to access that. So what I've also been telling administrative support staff is that we need to make sure that we have a Science CV account set up so that we're able to help PIs with their Science CV and biographical sketches and current and pending support documents. And so the other thing is, if you have an account, before you accept that invite from PI to be a delegate on their account, make sure that you're logged in so that it makes that connection. Because we've had some people who get that invite email and then they click on the accept, but if they're not actually logged into their account, it doesn't establish that. Again, not the end of the world. We can get the help desk to fix that, but it slows us down a bit. So accessing the Science CV as a delegate is very similar to My Bibliography, where you just sort of see the list of PIs who have shared access with their Science CV with us. So there's going to be a list that says Science CV accounts delegated to you, and then you would see your faculty or PIs that you support listed there. And if you don't see someone there, then you can contact them and ask if they can add you as a delegate, or if you need help and adding them as a delegate, we can walk them through that process as well. And then when we're working in a PI's Science CV platform, you'll see this sort of gold bar at the top that reminds us we're not working on our own, we're working in someone else's. And this is where I was mentioning, as delegates, we can still create a biosketch for you, we can still create a current and pending support document, but we can't sign it. So no longer is the case where we can kind of generate this document and then download the PDF for the proposal documents, now PIs are going to be required to download it and certify that the information is accurate. So what does this look like? So the good thing is, when you log into ScienceCV, you pick, the biosketch for NIH or the current and pending support document for NIH, which is not there yet, but it will be at the end of May. And then what we've been helping people do is kind of in the same way you might have a fillable PDF that you've been using as a template for your grant proposals, we just established an updated one, which is always good practice to work with the library anyways, to, import the latest and greatest publications that you have in your My Bibliography and update it at the same time. And then once you have that template, then you can use that as an existing document to populate any future biographical sketches or current and pending support documents. So you can then use, so we just have to update once in the summer, and then you can continually use that one, well, until the federal agencies update the federal common forms again, but at that moment, which is great. And then, as I mentioned before, so the only way to get citations into into a biographical sketch after May will be to import them directly from My Bibliography and/or ORCID. And so for the community that we're talking to today, it's going to be most likely My Bibliography where we're going to have your papers. But we will be connecting your ORCID with ScienceCV as well. So if you have other items in ORCID, and there's a lot of advantages to having citations in ORCID because you might have things like digital health innovations or data sets or software, other non-publication research products that you might want to highlight in a biosketch. And so ORCID is actually kind of ideal for importing some of those research products into your biosketch. Whereas, My Bibliography is also ideal for getting your journal articles from PubMed directly into My Bibliography and then directly into the biosketch. And so this is the other new thing is this certification process. So I can walk us through what this looks like for us as a support staff and what you see as the PI when you download these files. So in the biosketch, after we populate this, if you say like these are the publications that you want us to add, we can do that. But then we see, when we try to download the document, this box will pop up and say that, the PIs are required to certify this document before we can download it. So we can't download it until you have certified this document. And then when you log in, you see a different box that then explains that you need to review the document and certify that the information is accurate. And then you agree to that. Same thing with the current and pending support document. When we log in, we can add information on the awards that you have current or pending, but and the effort percentages and whatnot, but we can't download it until you download it and certify that the information is accurate and correct. So this is what we see, that the certification is required by the PI. And then when you log in, you'll have a box very similar to the biosketch one that says that you need to review that the information is accurate and sign off on that, which is good. And then after that's signed, then administrative staff, we can download it and then have that document with all of the other documents for your proposal. But we do have folks that need to go back in and change things from time to time. And we have to redo that recertification. So that signature is kind of frozen in time. So it's kind of versioned. And so once that is signed, we have to go back in to that template and make the changes, and then you're going to have to download it and certify again. So it's kind of that certification kind of travels along with the file. We can change the name of the file. We can download it and rename it. But anytime changes are made, we have to go back and do that certification process again. So this is just an example of what happens when I try to edit it. You'll say that the document has been signed and I can't edit it. So until you do the recertification again. But as I mentioned, you can still once it's certified, we can download it, we can rename it, and then add it to that proposal. As I mentioned today, we don't have time to do the ORCID part, but ORCID is not a government platform. It's a non-for-profit. ORCID is a persistent identifier for an author. So it's a unique ID that follows you, which is great if you have a common name and there's more than one author who has a name similar to yours that distinguishes you as an author. And this is going to be required to obtain, to add to your Science CV mini profile so that it appears on your biographical sketch and your current and pending support document. So we are helping folks with this as well. And in ORCID, you can also appoint administrative support staff as delegates. And that's a separate process that I help people through. So then we can add citations not only to your My Bibliography, but we can also add citations to your ORCID record as you need us to do, which is great. But we just want to make sure that folks are aware that these are separate systems. And so to get an ORCID, since it's a not-for-profit, it's an open access system. Anyone can get an ORCID at any time. And just by going to this URL at the top of the screen, if someone is affiliated with Brown, you can go to the Researchers at Brown page and scroll way to the bottom, and there's a box that says get a Brown ORCID identifier. And all that means is that it automatically, there's an API that will claim an ORCID number for you and then automatically affiliate your affiliation with Brown. It's just optional to do, but it's just sort of a quick way to grab an ORCID if folks don't have one. And then your profile, all you right now for the requirement for the Science CV is to have the ID. Excuse me. And so once you do that, you'll have that identifier. We follow those steps at the beginning of these slides to link that to your mini profile and link that to your MyNCBI profile. But since you have this ORCID set up, we can also help you in the library to populate it with the publications or other research outputs that you want to have, since this is a publicly available record that you might want to curate in the same way that you do your My Bibliography. And then once you add that, and then it shows up for you on your BioSketch and your current and pending support document. So you can see here on the current and pending support document, it says click here to link your ORCID ID. You click on that, it'll bring you back to ORCID. You authenticate, sign in, and then it will be linked automatically. And then this is what it looks like. It just shows up at the very bottom, linked to your mini profile. And so that now appears on the current and pending support document and on the BioSketch here, same thing. And so that's sort of the big change, is that it will be visible on these documents. And then the good thing, as I mentioned before, is in addition to My Bibliography, since you have a ORCID now and it's linked, you'll be able to import citations from either My Bibliography or ORCID. Doing this with physical sciences and NSF over the last year, we haven't had a lot of investigators who have had My Bibliographies, but some they've had ORCIDs and not. And so, but with NIH-funded researchers, it's likely that you probably have both My Bibliography and an ORCID, so you kind of have the option of importing citations from either or. Some issues we have is that you might be submitting a grant in the past that required you to get an ORCID. You might have been publishing a manuscript that required you to get an ORCID, and we might have some investigators that end up with more than one ID. And so then we have to call their help desk and merge those together. And so it's not the end of the world again, but it's just, it's supposed to be a persistent identifier. So that's supposed to be a unique ID for you, that number. But there is sort of the irony that we end up sometimes with unique IDs for the same author, but more than one. So we can easily fix that. There is a help desk in the same way with MyNCBI. They've been super fast. As we've transitioned NSF folks over the last year. So I'm hoping it's the same speed for the NIH going forward. But I realize that right now, there's a lot of dynamic changes going on at the federal level. So that's to be determined. But again, this summer, reach out to the library and we can help set up your Science CV account, get a updated biographical sketch set up so that you can use it as a template for any future grant proposals, and set up and populate an ORCID record. And here's my email, and I can stop here in case anyone has any questions otherwise.
Ready to make our new bio sketches? Yes.
I have one question. Sometimes when I work on My Bibliography, It's difficult to add like things that aren't already in Orchid. And so sometimes we have like book chapters or other kind of things that don't automatically hit PubMed. Is it good to add those things or should we wait for them to, I guess, be updated on their own so that we're getting like the best possible reference? Is there any duplication that happens when you add things?
Good question. Andrew, did you hear that question?
Yeah, that is a great question because I think, I'm trying to encourage folks to look at ORCID as kind of an advantage because, it is a little easier to add non-journal articles to an ORCID record than it is to my bibliography. There are things that we can add to my bibliography that folks can highlight in a biosketch that some folks are unaware of. Like, for example, preprints. Some folks are not aware that we can add a preprint so if you have a preprint in medRxiv, for example, or bioRxiv, we can add that from my bibliography. So we're happy to work and add these products to your my bibliography, even though I agree with you, it's a little more, it's a less straightforward. Whereas ORCID, I think that's an advantage where if you have book chapters, textbooks, other types of research, digital research products that, that hopefully going through the trouble of setting up an ORCID because I know there's a question in the chat box of how long does it take? And it's super fast to get the ORCID ID, but it's going to take some time to update the profile. And I will say that one advantage that Brown University Health and Brown has right now is that we have a subscription to not just Web of Science, but also Scopus. And Scopus has an API link with ORCID. And I use the example here, the biosketch, Professor Wang, the chair of chemistry at Brown, who had 544 publications over his career. We were able to import every single one of those directly from Scopus. We did a search within Scopus. There's a link where you can add ORCID to your Scopus profile, and then it just moved all of those publications over within, I'd say, a couple minutes for it to populate. He was great and had to go through those publications to make sure that it didn't bring in any other additional ones. And I think maybe, you know, sometimes there's maybe 4 or 5 papers that weren't authored by him. But that number was pretty impressive. So I will say, even with ORCID, their APIs that they have available with some of our libraries databases makes it easy to import some materials like chapters, books, and journal articles. Whereas if you have other digital research products like a data set, software, a digital health innovation, we still have to kind of manually do those. But hopefully, I think it's one of those advantages where now you have you can only import from ORCID or my bibliography, but it's nice to have the option.
Great, thank you. Yeah. Follow up.
I have one more question about the grants. So with adding R1s and DO1s and things like that, it seems to be really easy to find those in my book, in the NCBI platform. But for NSF grants, it's not always easy to import those and to make sure that we're attributing each publication to that in this platform. And how important is that in terms of auditing and the risk of, coming back and saying, well, we paid for this publication, but we're not being given credit for it in your NCBI?
Get that, Andrew?
Yeah, that's a great question as well, because with the NSF transition that we had last year, folks were used to using research.gov, the platform that they use to fill out their project and final reports. And they have a sort of a PubMed central repository called NSF PAR, which stands for NSF Public Access Repository. And there's a couple hurdles we've had with our health science folks when they're doing the compliance part within research.gov. One is that it requires you to have a PDF-A version of your final peer-reviewed manuscript. And so then we've had, folks that go through a lot of trouble to locate the final peer-reviewed final author manuscript accepted for publication. They go through the trouble of formatting as a PDF-A, and then once they put in their DOI, lo and behold, it ends up showing the version of record. Whereas PubMed Central doesn't do that. PubMed Central, we tag the grant within my bibliography. We upload the final peer-reviewed manuscript to the NIMS system. It takes several weeks for that to occur. And then usually what appears in PubMed Central is only the final peer review manuscript and not the version of record. So there is a learning curve, I think, on both sides. So I think that's a great case where, I mean, one of the reasons that the version of record shows up in NSF system is they had an agreement with some scientific publishers where the government still wanted to have a PDFA so that they could archive it. And then the research.gov platform, where some of our health science folks are not used to going in to associate the grant with the award. We're happy in the library to help to walk folks through that and to put the DOI into that system in the same way we've been doing with NIH. And so I think I'm hoping that the transition after May will be smoother because folks are familiar with my NCBI. But in the same way we told NSF funded folks last year, like because they're new to my NCBI, we said, hey, come reach out to us in the library and we'll help you use this system. And so I will offer the same invitation here for health science folks doing NSF awards that if you need help in research.gov, that we can also help folks with that compliance part because I know NIH public access compliance is also changing at the end of this year. Like, for example, they're removing the 1-year embargo. The 12-month embargo will be removed unless NIH changes this, of course. But at least right now we're on track. And so we're probably going to have a lot of folks asking about, how that embargo situation changes.
Yes.
Andrew, I haven't got a chance to do the new science TV. Do you have an example? How does it look like? What is the difference of better or worse than the biosketch you using?
Yeah, definitely. I think, I mean, the good news is that, there's still a section in which you have to put your publications in. You have to select 5 publications. So overall, I think a lot of the common form changes had to do with the government document called NSPM 33 that has to do with like research integrity because there were some cases in which folks might have had funding from external resources that were not reported. So I think, our research integrity colleagues can give us more background and on how those forms came to be. But at least from the library side, we haven't had, we've had questions, of course, with folks who are new to Science EV, setting up their new biosketch as a template. But it seems pretty straightforward. So I would say that a lot of the changes really just have to do with like documenting.
Oh, Laura Stroud online has a question.
Yeah, I was just wondering, I think a lot of us update the personal statement to be part of, to fit any given grant that we're doing. How does that work? Can you talk a little bit about how any tips or suggestions? Do you just erase each one and put in a new one, or how do you recommend dealing with the personal statement?
So the good thing is once you create a biosketch within Science EV, it's sort of you keep all the copies of everyone that you've generated. So you'll see a list of everyone that you generate for a grant. And then in future, you can go back and pick one of those as a template. Yeah, that's a great advantage.
Fantastic.
Yeah. And so what folks have done is so for NSF last summer, we had some folks who just wanted to create sort of a generic one where they could go in. But that's a great point with the personal statement. If you want to have more customized ones, you could create several and then choose between, so we don't necessarily have to create one template. You can create more than one template.
Fantastic. That's amazing. Thank you.
Mhm.
Else online?
Andrew, I have one question. I support a doctor who also has several hundred publications and helping to set him up with some of this, I noticed that his orchid is barren. So I want to know if Scopus is something that you need to have an account for. How do I populate from that resource? Yeah, that'd be very helpful.
Yeah, I definitely want to plug because Scopus is new for us. We've had Web of Science for a really long time. When the university and Brown University Health, with their collaboration on ramping up research as I think the current momentum, that a lot of health science researchers said they really, really wanted access to Scopus, and we have it. And because, we never know how budgets are going to be in the near future, I'm telling people like use it as much as you can right now. And so I think that's a great use case for Scopus is that it integrates really well with ORCID. You can search for the investigator's name. Scopus will do a great job of generating an AI-generated profile for someone. So if you have an investigator who has not claimed their record, like for example, Eung Cho, we met once and she had a profile that was generated for like EY Cho. One was for like Cho Eun Young. It sort of created EY Cho, like it created 3 different profiles. But most of them were accurate. And so we were able to merge those profiles. And once she claims her Scopus record, that import through ORCID is very fast, and it does a great job of locating the papers and pulling those in. And then they have them at their fingertips when they're generating a biosketch within ScienceCV.
And how can I access that Scopus record? Like, where can I find that in the Brown University resources?
Yeah, so if you're on the library homepage, there's a guide for health sciences right on the front of the page. And there's a link to databases. You can also go to our database A to Z list and type in Scopus. And we also have what's called a best bet. So if you just go into the search bar at the top of the library homepage and type in Scopus, it will come up as a best bet.
Great, thanks so much.
Well, thank you.
Another question? All right, well, thank you, Andrew. That was very helpful.
Okay, thank you very much.
All right, we'll move on to our next section, which I'm really looking forward to. Hi, Hamish. Hamish and Amina. Great. And they're going to be talking to us about innovations in AI applications to research and healthcare. Thank you. Whatever you're on here or there, whatever you're most comfortable with. Are we putting our own laptop up already?
I have them.
It's up there, okay.
I'll just block show you.
Right. Okay. Wow.
Give me 1 second.
So it's like.
Okay, so I'm looking forward to just talking a little bit about some of the background to all this excitement and hoopla about AI. It seems like each time we think it's going to quiet down a little bit, something new comes along. So the last 10 years have been very interesting upstream. Though historically, it's been a much more rocky road. If you worked in this area over the years, you find that in fact, huge downswings when everybody basically no funding and it was very difficult to do stuff and then it would come back up again. Okay, so
You pointed toward sort of the television up here in front of you.
oh, okay, there we go. Right. Yeah. Okay, so really early on, there were actually quite a few interesting projects done with terms of calculating risks of diseases. This is a little description of a number of studies. In fact, some of them go way back to the 1950s. And this was a hollow-written punch card machine, which you could use actually for doing differential diagnosis. And they looked at hematological disease. And it was basically kind of a card system with holes in the cards, and they dropped down. So that was a very early system, which I saw an example of when I was a medical student. And then going forward, you saw people starting to use very early computers. This is the early EDAC, which is a system which was developed really one of the very earliest sort of mechanical computers. This one actually had bugs, real bugs in it. And so one of the very first diagnosis programs, this was actually for carcinoma of the lung, and they looked at factors that were present or absent in both patients that had the disease and patients that didn't have the disease, and then did some calculations, essentially sort of multiple linear equations, which took, I think it was 9.5 hours on the primitive old computer then, but it was one of the very early ones. And then moving forward, things started to get more sophisticated. And so this is a system that was originally developed in the late 60s, and this is a study from 1972. And what was happening there was that Tim de Dombel, who was a surgeon, was very concerned about high missed appendicitis rates and high rates of perforated appendicitis in the UK. And so decided to build a system which is based on simple Bayesian method. So if a symptom was present in a certain disease and not present in the patient not having the disease, you could calculate from a data set the probability of that disease by taking the original chance of having appendicitis and then adding higher probabilities as you go forward with these different symptoms or lower probabilities. And we'll come back to that a little bit later. But essentially, it was very simple algorithm. You could run it on the simplest calculator today, but it was relatively accurate. In fact, you could get significantly better accuracy on a number of diagnoses. And it's actually a system that I first got to use as a surgical medical student. And we got really interested in this idea. They did a randomized controlled trial, multi-center trial in the 80s, showed that it significantly reduced perforated appendix rate. But it was ahead of its time, and unfortunately, Tim de Dombel died of a heart attack during that process, and it sort of just went away. But actually, it today still has some of the best results. So it was an interesting example of how relatively simple ideas that are really well integrated into clinical care can make a difference. It's not just how clever your algorithm is; it's really a lot about things that really make sense in a kind of clinical context. Struggling with this one. So another thing that I'm sure you've all seen are these risk scores. So before we had mobile apps, a lot of time people would actually create a scoring system. They might use something like logistic regression, and they would calculate, for example, 10-year risk of cardiovascular disease, or in this case, risk of stroke in patients with atrial fibrillation. And so then from those, you calculate some simple scoring systems. You maybe have 1 point for this age and 2 points for an older age and so on. And then you'd add this up on a little piece of paper. And when the score came out at the bottom, you decide, well, did this patient need anticoagulation? Or, for example, the one that's been used a lot for many years, does the patient have strep throat as opposed to a viral throat infection? And there are many examples of these. And the problem, of course, is that they're a little bit time consuming, but they're also very simple and they don't really pick up things like the more subtle differences in age or any of the kind of more subtle changes that could give you more accurate results. And so clearly it's something that we've sort of moved on from with EHRs and mobile apps and so on. So then the next sort of step, which was took for was called the rule-based systems or sometimes expert systems. And so those were really designed to capture the knowledge of experts. And so, for example, a specialist physician would spend days, weeks, maybe going through these interviews and developing all these rules. And the rule would say that if a patient has this symptom on this side, this test result, then this particular diagnosis is more likely. And you chain all these rules together, and then eventually you have a system that would diagnose patients. And sometimes it worked, but it was very fragile. Little changes in things, little changes in the way the patient was presenting for a problem, and it could take a really long time to do this. So it kind of worked, but had its problems. The best example was a thing called mycin, problem that we look at so much today. How do you manage sepsis or potential sepsis? And so Ted Shortliff at Stanford in the 70s developed this very successful expert system that asked questions about the patient's condition in terms of whether they had any particular risk factors for disease, and then could go into the detail. Bring it up here so I can see more detail. It's a little far away. But anyway, the last question was like, does the patient have a persistent headache or other neurological symptoms? Trying to obviously look at whether the patient might have meningitis. And then this information was put together and produce a recommendation for whether the patient required treatment, and if so, what kind of antibiotics or what other investigations were needed. So it was never really used clinically, but it did outperform the Stanford ID faculty. So that gave a lot of kudos. And it kind of led to a big explosion of work in this area for a while. But it didn't kind of stick. So there were a number of challenges that probably it took a very long time, about 30 minutes to use it, which obviously wasn't going to work well for most people. It was very kind of specialized. It wasn't very helpful for, say, a primary care physician or an ED physician to get quick advice on something. So then the question was, who use these tools for doing diagnosis? And so the big excitement in the early, to the 70s and into the 80s of building diagnosis systems, and people spent literally thousands of person hours collecting all the information about different diagnoses and producing these tools, which would give you advice on the differential diagnosis of the patient. The two of the best known ones were Internist, which is University of Pittsburgh, and also DXplain at Mass General Hospital. And that's it. DXplain is still kind of used, or at least it was until recently. You plug in a whole bunch of information from the patient, and sometimes I think from the EHR could pick up that data as well, but you then get a list of diagnoses. And it wasn't all that accurate, but it could sometimes give you ideas about patients with different problems. But it never really kind of got too far. And so it's sort of that point was one of the places where people were disillusioned with AI and kind of got beaten down for a while. There was no funding. But at the same time, in the 70s, people started order entry systems. So there, obviously, the idea was more directed to which medications you're going to prescribe and what were the constraints in terms of what dose you would use, whether there are contraindications due to allergies or adverse events, or if the patient was contraindicated because of that drug, because of, say, renal failure. And that information you can plug into the system and actually work pretty well. People liked it, it was a bit quicker, you could do repeat prescribing more effectively. And it became one of the real success stories of health informatics. It is a rule-based system, but it's really simple. You just have lots of really kind of one-level rules that define the different aspects of risks and so on. And so, of course, these are very widely used, but they don't kind of do anything terribly sophisticated. And mainly what they have is a gigantic database of all the interactions between different drugs and drugs in different conditions. And of course, one of the problems we learned from this is that these very simple systems are great when you have a handful of rules, and they become increasingly painful and impossible to use when you have thousands of them. Every time you try to do something. So it's become a real art to go through and try and prune these rules and try and decide with a sort of committee which ones we're going to keep. It was kind of a limitation of this. So then we're looking at the Bayesian method. And so one of the challenges of these earlier systems was they didn't really handle probability, the risk of particular diseases, patients well. And so Bayes' theorem was one of the ways to say this. We know the prevalence of particular diseases in this group of patients, and we know that these particular symptoms and lab tests and other findings will either increase or decrease our belief in that particular disease. And so you can chain those together in a fairly clean way, and that's how the abdominal pain diagnosis works. But when you do this, you can work with small projects problems, but it doesn't always work for a really big scale. And this is one actually was looking at an early system for figuring out whether a patient had actually got whether a woman high risk of having Down syndrome baby, and this was looking at alpha-fetoprotein and the patient's age before we had good ultrasound and 3D DNA testing and so on. And so it used this simple method, but actually worked pretty well. It was used very widely in the world. Then the next step was, well, we can't really take this too much further because the data wouldn't give you very clear answers for more complicated problems. But then an invention came up called the Bayesian network, Bayesian belief network, and that was really one of the things that we use a lot today. And so what that does, it uses the benefit of all the nice clean mathematics for probabilities in Bayes' theorem, but you create a network structure, and so you have all different findings of the patient, what kind of disease they might have, what symptoms they have, and then you can also model underlying factors of the system, for example, or some other system, and then they're linked together by these probability links. So these systems are developed by a team of experts. They do a huge amount of literature review and search, and they also kind of look at all the different problems that can potentially limit the patient's, for example, cardiovascular condition and cardiac output. And so when you put these together, you can actually do both diagnosis, but also model some of the problems and maybe the treatments that are required for the patient. And so this is an example that I worked with back in during my fellowship in the 90s, for the heart disease program. And it was an early example of one of these systems, which had a cardiovascular model. So what you had here, well, so we have this cardiac output, blood pressure, sympathetic state, so how much much adrenaline there is, or how much stimulation of the sympathetic nervous system, and then also vascular resistance. And through that, you can then model whether this patient with potential heart failure has particular conditions. And it turned out to actually work pretty well. And we did a clinical trial of this, very early web-based interface during my fellowship. And what we were able to show was that when the resident physicians who were admitting emergency cardiology cases use this system, so they actually use it in their own shift, when we looked at their diagnosis lists, the heart disease program had more correct diagnoses on the list. In this case, we're looking at the most serious life-threatening diagnoses, and so the HDP had a higher sensitivity for those than the physicians. But then if you combine their results, it was better still. So in theory, it should have been a way of really helping you to make better diagnoses. It didn't actually get used clinically, but it did get tested clinically, which was good. Okay, so moving on to sort of the next step, really a lot of what's happening now is looking at questions of how we classify different problems or patient groups or whatever. And so using classification algorithms, we collect different data on patients and then try and determine which of the be a category of diagnosis or other kind of problem patient falls into. So here what we have is just a simple diagram. This is looking at data. So you have one measurement and then another measurement against that. And so if you plot that, you can see that those patients, it's not terribly clear, but they're blue triangles and mostly inside that loop, which would be our sort of decision boundary between what has a disease and what doesn't have a disease. And so some people fall in the wrong side of that boundary, and so obviously you don't get a completely accurate test result. So this is a very simple example. If you have 20 or 30 things you're looking at, it would be like a 20, 30 or 30 dimension model, but we don't have to think about it that way. But essentially what it's doing is saying, how do we build an algorithm that helps us separate out the different classes in that data without having to actually build it by hand? And so this is where application algorithms, things like logistic regression and then machine learning really come in, where you know what the correct labels of these examples, and then you can actually train the system to recognize whether a particular patient or case or problem falls into one category or the other. And so this helps us to then build simple support systems which can classify different groups. And so we did an example of that back in the 90s as well, looking at, for example, diagnosis of chest pain in the emergency department, and able to show that you could actually classify patients pretty accurately based upon their presenting symptoms and EKG data. And some of that work, which was also done at New England Medical Center, led to a system that was used in the Hewlett-Packard EKG machines that actually predicts the risk of myocardial infarction. So this kind of approach worked pretty well for very specific tasks, but they're kind of linear tasks where in fact, if you looked at this diagram here, it wouldn't be like a wiggly line, it would actually be a sort of a straight line that went between the tasks. And so simpler ones were quite easy to do, but they kind of had limitations at that point. And so one of the things we found was that if you were to kind of build a very simple example, then you could often make it clear what were the criteria that led to the decision. And so they were kind of interpretable results. On the other hand, if you use your backpropagation neural network, which is sort of the standard version that was used in those days, you don't really get any idea what it's doing. It just tells you the result. And so that's like a black box algorithm. And so there are sort of pros and cons to that. Sometimes the black box algorithms work better, but you don't have that sort of feedback as well. So the development of neural networks with way back in like the 50s and 60s, when people first thought, well, let's pretend that we had a model of a neuron, and it has a whole bunch of dendrites. We feed data in the dendrites, that's kind of the middle diagram there. And then we add up results from all of those inputs. But when it reaches the cell body, and if it reaches a certain total threshold, then it puts an output. And this is kind of the idea of a neuron with the dendrites and the axon and so on. And so people model that, and they found they could use it for simple problems, linearly separable problems. But then a very famous researcher called Marvin Minsky, who was a world expert on the rule-based stuff, AI stuff, wrote a book which really kind of demolished the whole field. I think they're very famous, and everyone believed it. Just about that time, a number of people, including Hinton, the guy who won the Nobel Prize recently for work on neural networks, invented a backpropagation algorithm that let you build multiple layers. So you end up with what's called a multiple layer neural network, and that can represent much more complex data. And that was the moment when we started to move from really simple problems to being able to do much more. And this is the basis for all these kind of fancy things like the systems for X-rays and retinal scans and so on. And the whole kind of move into being able to classify images in all different ways. And that's been really one of the big success stories where we do have a lot of applications that have shown to work well. And unlike most AI, they've actually had clinical trials. And so we actually have some solid clinical data that these things will work in various situations. And there's still a lot more work to do, but the basic idea was that you had to build much more complex models, and then you could represent more complex things. But that invention back in the 70s and 80s took a really long time to work through. Part of that was because we didn't have anything like enough data, and our computers were incredibly slow. So this is where the really big change was in having very fast processors, these graphics processors that made NVIDIA the richest company in the world and all that. That was the piece you needed with much larger amount of data, much larger processing. And then once you did that, you could start to represent these complex things. That was the big sort of step forward. So other things that were really important in the early days were diagnosis of EKGs. And this was one of the early success stories back, I mean, probably 30 years or so ago. We had reasonably good algorithms that would actually give you a diagnosis of many aspects of EKG findings. And so these tools do things like recognizing a certain change. So this is a patient who is probably giving a myocardial infarction. And so they have this abnormality on the right side, which is circled. And so then they would produce an algorithm which would let you add this together. And, oh, of course, it did it perfectly when I had my machine. It's changed on the screen. Anyway, basically, it measures the height at different points along the signal, and then it uses that to determine whether this patient has ST elevation. So I checked it just before we got up. Anyway, so the next step with this was what was called convolutional neural networks. So back in the 90s, when I was doing my original AI work, we had this course on computer vision. And part of what the focus was on a thing called convolution, which is that when the human visual cortex receives the information from the retina, it processes it in very specific ways, and one of which is that it has these center surround cells, part of a group of maybe maybe 9 sort of pixels, if you like, or that would be a large number, be like 16. The center part gets the signal, and then the surround gets a much lower signal. And this is a very good way of actually pulling out shapes and lines and things. And the visual cortex does the very first of processing. So it turns out if you build these neural networks with backpropagation, with huge amounts of data, which originally was mostly cats, I think, was India. Was it cats they turned it on? And I think anyways, and they basically got all this data from the internet, fed it in, and were able to create convolution in the system. It actually invented it itself, if you like, from the way the data was actually processed. And so these convolutional neural networks then were able to recognize it in different images, and you could actually take a system that was trained on various animal photographs and things like that, and convert it and adapt it to work on things like X-ray, which is interesting. But it was sort of the beginning of this architecture, which is partly designed by people and mostly developed from the data by feeding the right example. And so that's been a really big step forward, and has allowed us to do a lot of really exciting things. And we're seeing, especially with things like ophthalmology, some really great results. The ability, for example, screen for diabetic retinopathy, just with a simple handheld device, often in low countries who don't have that kind of expertise as well. So there's a nice paper which I've listed here, which is called the 3 epochs of artificial intelligence in healthcare. They talked a bit about the different stages and worth looking at actually. It's not very long, but it has these 3 categories. So the first one is symbolic and probabilistic models. And then we have deep learning, so that's all the neural network side of things and some other related techniques, like random forests, where you have lots and lots of little rules, but they behave a bit like neural networks. And then the third generation is they call it foundation models, generative AI, large language models, this whole group of new things. And this is where Amina is going to tell you about those work. But the main difference is that instead of classifying stuff, they actually generate new stuff. And I think for a lot of people, it was a bit of a shock when that happened, because it wasn't really obvious that the people who were toiling away doing the language processing thing were going to revolutionize the entire world. But because they were actually generating new content, it turned out that could actually do useful. And so that's where we are in this kind of newer large language model, ChatGPT kind of world. So building on some of the earlier stuff, but really doing things in different ways. So in the sort of standard machine learning, we call supervised machine learning, usually, you have a set of data and you know the correct answer. And you train the system with that data. And that produces information, a model of that information. So this is an example of different kinds of ways of training systems. So essentially, the main takeaway here is that when you train a model, you start off with data at the top, and these are 3 different ways you could actually train it. But you have to separate a training set and some kind of a test or validation set. So you train the model and then you test it on new data. The problem is that when you train the model, it gets really, really good at recognizing every single idiosyncrasy and every single wrinkle in the data. And then you try it on new unclassified problems or patients or whatever, it tends to do much worse. So what you do is you hold out some of the data and once you've got it working really well in training, then you take it onto new data and you say, well, does it still work? Turns out that can give you a much better performance, but ultimately you have to then test it on completely new data from somewhere else. And only then can you start to be confident this actually might work generally well. So the biggest limitation of these models is that they typically don't generalize from the original data to new sites very well. And so you often have to keep testing. You may have to retrain it by giving it new data and actually giving the system a chance to learn new patterns, or just testing to see whether it actually is able to handle a broad range of things. And this becomes particularly problematic when we're looking at different patient groups and different, the questions of patients, who are older, younger, or generation or ethnic groups, or whether there's difference between women and men, which you would see certainly in things like chest pain diagnosis, and so all these different groups potentially can be at risk if your data set doesn't represent a whole range of different patients and potential situations. And that's been obviously a real concern. So we use a number of metrics. I won't dig into it, but this is the ROC curve, and this is a really good way of totaling up the sensitivity and specificity of models at different thresholds and give you a sense of their overall performance. We often use this to compare models in maybe testing 2 different models on a test step and say, well, this one works better, it's got a better ROC curve. That's a good indication it's a good model, but doesn't really tell you everything. Another thing we do is actually calibration. So if say you were going to predict whether a patient had a risk of cardiovascular disease, 10 years cardiovascular disease, you want to see how accurate it was. No, the overall accuracy might be pretty good, but if in younger patients the probability is wrong, or older patients the probability is wrong, then although the overall performance is good, you can see that it's actually not working so well for some subgroups. So this is kind of a simple way that we look for some of these limitations that, the broad performance is good, but there are limitations within it. The other big problem with all this stuff is that once you say you're using a system that's going to be helping clinicians, nurses, other healthcare workers to manage patients, the model can do really great. It can come up with some really great answers. But then when it actually comes to the question of how do you use that information, it has to be displayed and communicated to clinicians. And the question then is, how do you do that? And how do you actually give people the best information? This turns out to be a problem that's really under-researched, and we need a lot of work on it. So you can come up with really great systems, but people often don't use them, or they don't really know how to use the output. this is an example of a system that's developed. Quite nice study, actually, quite a little study looking at risk of patients requiring ventilation who were admitted with COVID. And what it was doing is looking at this top there is the sort of higher level of risk, and then classifying which patients were correctly allocated in that group and whether they actually had serious complications or died. But the strange fish-like diagram in the middle, what it's showing is the red spots are the ones that actually died from COVID. And you can see that although there's definitely more on the right-hand end, that group stretches right across. And so, you know, it's not perfect. This is what you see when the model is only partially accurate. And from a clinical point of view, you have to think, well, you know, this might be helpful for me, but you still have other information. And so it becomes quite difficult to know how to communicate that. You know, I have my time here. And so the last thing I was going to talk about briefly is diagnostic decisions. So how do we actually help to support diagnosis? And so a lot of work previously on that, which didn't work brilliantly, but more recently we started to see that diagnosis become a much more bigger concern. People recognize it's a very major, potentially serious adverse events and infections. And so one of the questions is how could we improve that? This is an example where people have started to say, well, let's use diagnosis directly to patients. So people have been Googling their symptoms for a long time. Now there are symptom checkers that let you help diagnose yourself or your family member. And this is one called Isabel, one of the early ones. And an early study just using made up clinical cases, which showed that there's a huge range of performance. Some of the best ones were 63% accurate, sensitive for the diagnosis, but the poor ones were really about 30%. And physicians on the same data were given back. So we looked at a study system developed in Germany called Ada Health, which has this Bayesian network, and it actually worked pretty well. Takes a reasonably good history, and they were interested in doing some research. So we actually studied this in Rhode Island Hospital, starting actually working with Megan Rainey about 5 years ago now, actually 6 years ago. And we were able to look at the performance of the system when patients used it before they were seen in the emergency department. And then we used that data to compare that with the final diagnosis from the physicians to see how accurate it was, and also got the data from the system and just gave it to 3 independent physicians who blind read that data to access some of the algorithms. So having done this study, it showed that Ada worked reasonably well in terms of diagnosis and triage accuracy. Then along came ChatGPT, so we're able to feed it some of this data. And it turns out that the studies on large language models like ChatGPT, very, very few so far have actually used real patient data. So it turns out this was actually a useful thing to do. And this is the basic idea. The patient is seeing, they use the Ada app, and then the emergency department visit, they would actually see the ED physician and then compare the diagnoses. And then the 3 physicians in the middle were independently reading the data. And this is the results we saw. So Ada is on the left-hand side, ChatGPT 3.5 and 4. This is a year and a half ago. WebMD, and then the 3 physicians, their mean performance. You can see actually was, Ada did reasonably well. 3.5 looked really good for diagnosis. ChatGPT 4 didn't do so well. And then what was really interesting was that 3.5 had really unsafe triage. So it had much, much higher risk of triaging seriously ill patients to routine care. And so that was a real concern. And it suggested there was a real problem. And since then, we've done a whole bunch more research, working with a whole bunch of students, and also me has been working on this. We've seen a big, big difference where a system can come up with really accurate diagnosis and a completely wrong triage, or sometimes the other way around. And the 2 things are not connected, which is really concerning. So finally, this is actually looking at comparing Ada with ChatGPT. And although ChatGPT performed reasonably well on diagnosis, the people who used it were less likely to use the information from ChatGPT than from a system like Ada. So again, this problem, how do we communicate data? Mina, would you like to take it? So. Yes. So, is the slides up there?
Yeah, I think so.
Other way, I think.
Maybe keep going. Yes. Sorry, didn't know they would show up.
Okay. Yeah.
think I have to speak up because there's no mic or something. My name is Amina, and today I'll be talking about applications. Actually, updated this, but I think you're using like a yesterday's version. I updated the slides this morning.
Would it be okay just to use these or?
So I'll be talking about applications of large language models in healthcare. But I will start by just going straight to the point. I don't want to bore you about like how LLMs were made and all that. So I'll just talk about the challenges in clinical care first. And then from there, we'll talk about like how AI can help and their limitations too. So the first problem I'd like to talk about is physician burnout. I'm not sure if most of you here understand that in clinical care, a physician has to like attend to several patients, and sometimes, or in fact, most times you have to like document your encounters with a patient. In fact, a study from Medscape reported that 42% of US physicians experience burnout. And one of the most popular causes of burnout is the time the doctors spend in documenting patient encounters. So is it possible for us to automate this EHR entry? And if this is possible, will it help reduce physician burnout? So that's just a question, and I'll answer this question later. Another example of a clinical care challenge is that emergency medicine physicians have the highest burnout rates. I can say this because imagine a patient is sick in the middle of the night. The first place the person is going to go to is the emergency department. Imagine if you have so many people coming to the emergency department, all with like a weapon or something. Physician department, the ED becomes very busy, and then the physician becomes like really stressed out. So this also can add to the physician burnout. And when the physician is stressed, it can increase the patient's risk of medical errors. So we feel like better triaging can actually help, because if we have better triaging systems, we can divert low acuity cases to like other, maybe primary care and so on, and this might help. So failure to address like issues like physician burnout and maybe proper triaging in the ED department can lead to like diagnostic errors. So this image here is just trying to give us a summary of what diagnostic errors are. So diagnostic errors are, in summary, a leading cause of death. And this figure shows that over 80 million diagnostic errors are made each year. And out of these 18 million diagnostic errors, 74,000 of them can lead to death. But the good news is that diagnostic accuracy can be improved if we consult multiple physicians. Like, so if, for instance, I'm a patient and multiple physicians are looking after me, but it's expensive. And think about like low middle income countries. They don't have the luxury of many physicians. But we can supplement the physician's workflow by using automated diagnostic tools. So how can AI help? Of course, I'll just give a brief summary of what AI is. In fact, I asked an AI system this question. So AI, in summary, is a simulation of human intelligence in machines, enabling them to learn, reason, and make decisions. But AI is a lot. We have so many branches of AI, and today I'm interested in large language models. So a large language model is a subset of AI that's trained on massive data sets to enable this machine understand, process, and generate human language. So this has been trained using deep learning. And large language models can generate text. So the input of a large language model is language, and then the output is language too. It's interesting because it looks like it's understanding you. So an example, these are examples of large language models, Google Bard and OpenAI's ChatGPT. So, but this is just a definition of AI in general. But what about AI with respect to healthcare? Several studies came out after ChatGPT to tell us and show us that large language models like ChatGPT encode clinical knowledge. A study from Google. Another study also came out from Stanford, trying to tell us that large language models are few short clinical information extractors. So what it means is that these large language models can extract clinical information from text. So in essence, they're just trying to tell us that these models understand clinical language. Then this popular study also came out where ChatGPT was compared to like some physicians or medical students. They compared them in the United States medical licensing exams, and they showed that the ChatGPT models outperform most most medical students. And this blew up the whole large language models in the medical care, and everyone started thinking about like, how can we actually use these AI tools to improve the clinician workflow? So now I'm going to talk about some of these applications that have come out post ChatGPT to help improve the clinician's workflow. So I'll start by talking about each of those problems I brought earlier and how AI is trying to help solve them. So let's talk about the physician burnout problem in terms of the documentation. So this image here is a AI-powered medical voice dictation and scribe system developed by Intron Health. This is actually used in low middle income countries. You can see there's a voice panel. So imagine when a physician comes into, when a patient comes to see a physician, the physician has to just turn on the system, and then this system starts like documenting the encounter between this patient and the doctor, and it starts to populate each section the doctor is talking about or the physician is talking about. So for instance, here is the doctor is interested in the presenting complaint, and this system is recording it and automatically populating it. So tools like this can help alleviate documentation burdens and improve clinicians' workflow. But it comes with problems. So this here is a snippet from Dr. Gordon Sheet from Harvard, the DEX 2024. So in summary, what he was trying to say here is that this voice assistant are not perfect. In fact, he tested a tool. It missed key information about like social data relevant to the patient's health, and it also made errors in drug effect. And this is also worrisome because sometimes we can think about like over-reliance in the doctor. So some doctors can become very reliant on the AI tool and becomes like he can lose confidence in his or herself. So other problems are like security problems, because imagine this tool is taking the voice. What is it going to do with this encounter? Is it going to be used to train another AI system? So those are like some of the questions we need to ask ourselves. Another problem with these tools is that it leads to biases. So because these models are trained most times with like Western data, when they take them to maybe a low middle income country, it doesn't work effectively. So there's a lot of testing that needs to be done to actually make sure that if this tool is built with the data from the United States, it can actually work in maybe Indonesia and so on. So now we move to another problem, the emergency department problem. So here I'm interested in like triaging, because one of the biggest problems with the emergency department is having many patients that need emergency care. So is it possible for us to use AI system to improve like self-triaging? So we have several technologies that try to improve stroke recognition, but there are very few that help patients to self-recognize if they have like a symptoms of stroke. And if they recognize they have a symptom of stroke early, if they go to the emergency department earlier, it might help save their lives. So this study here was conducted using patient's information from Rhode Island Hospital. And this study involved patient history and physical exams. And then the ground truth was actually gotten from a neurologist. So we just took a random subset of 500 records and we fed it into ChatGPT. So there are different types of ChatGPT system. So the one we all use on our phones is the chat interface. And then there's a different version where if you want to like send multiple requests, it's called the API version. So we wanted to see if the version on the phone will behave similarly with the API version. So that's why we had to use two different versions to see if we ask these two different versions a question about a patient's health condition, if we get similar responses or similar behaviors. So the prompt just requests 5 most likely diagnoses and what level of care should the patient seek. Should the patient stay at home? Should the patient seek routine care, or should the patient seek emergency care? So this table here is just a summary of the results here. So the ChatGPT 4o is the chat interface one, and then the 4o is the one that you have to send through the API. So if you look at this, the sensitivity here is the chat version has higher sensitivity compared to the API version. But if you look at the PPV rate, it has a lower PPV rate. So in summary here is that these language models have the potential to help, but there's a lot of variation in their behavior. So how am I sure I'm gonna get 100% from this version? So it's worrisome, and we need to actually like do some kind of clinical trials or like randomized control clinical trials before we allow patients to actually start using these systems. So, and then the last problem I'm going to talk about is the diagnostic error problem. So here we try to see if these large language models can actually, we've tested them for like triaging, we've tested them for like documentation. Can they actually perform complex diagnostics? Because the study compared them to like medical students and showed that it passed the United States licensing exams. So what will these systems do if they are faced with actual complex diagnostics? So in this study, we designed different prompt strategies because like Dr. Fraser said earlier, these systems are sensitive to prompts. So a prompt just means how we ask this model questions. So we tried out 3 different prompts. That's what we have: approach 1, 2, and 3. And we wanted to see how consistent these models will be depending on the different prompts. So this figure is just trying to show us feeding these different prompts to the language model and getting their different responses and just seeing if they are consistent. So we tried different models here, the Google model, different versions of ChatGPT, and the medical language model. And then we also compared them to the human consensus. So this case is, I'm sure you're part of the New England Journal case challenges. So we took some of these cases, and some of these cases are already answered by some physicians online. So we just collected the results. The dotted line, the black dotted line, just shows the average human consensus. And the biggest takeaway here is that these language models have the potential to, in fact, outperform the human average consensus, but it all depends on the prompt. If you look at approach 1, their performance was really bad. But the problem is, how can I know which prompt to give these models beforehand? How am I sure if approach 1 is the best prompt, or approach 2, or approach 3? We still don't know. So we need to like do a lot of studies with these models before we just deploy them and say, oh, they are perfect or they are ready to be used. So the biggest takeaways from here is just to say that these AI tools have the potentials to improve diagnostic accuracy and care, and in fact, improve the clinician's workflow. But they face challenges in terms of prompt sensitivity, the privacy risk, because if I put in my data into this AI, where is it going to go to? And then they have like biases, and then they're just inconsistent across platforms. So to ensure effective safety and use of these tools, we need to do more tests. We need to conduct more evaluation. And I'm a computer science student, and I tell some of my colleagues that when we want to build these tools, we need to work with the stakeholders, that's the doctors, but we need to come together and work together to improve these tools for our improved workflow and to improve patient health care. So yeah, thank you. Oh, sorry, I have one more slide. If you're interested in like getting started with like some AI tools, the library at Brown have like some nice websites to tell you about AI. And then there's the Advanced AI Center also like have like consultation times and so on. So you can just take a picture of this, and you can also contact me if you have. Thank you.
Thank you. Question from yes, yeah.
So, it's great work. So, I think you touched upon about the different ethnic background when you were doing this data analysis and machine learning. So, the models you are developing here. So, are you testing that in like a global south or other ethnic group places or low middle income countries to see the accuracy?
Well, yes, it's a really big question. So the only project I'm currently working with Joe Hogan, where we're actually developing models to predict missed patient visits ratio in patients in AMPAT in Kenya. And so there we're looking at a whole group of patients and very diverse community there, a lot of different health facilities across a large geographic area. So we are finding some of those questions even in that community. But I think your point is absolutely critical that we don't even have very good consistency in Rhode Island with these models at the moment. So clearly, there's going to be some problems when you try to use systems in different places. And I think so Ada did a study, there's a company did a study in Tanzania where they actually modified their system and added 148 new diagnoses that were common, more tropical diseases that were more common there. And got some reasonable results by sort of really carefully tailoring it to that particular population. With large language models, we're going to do some experiments, but it's really important we actually measure how well they behave. And as you see, the triage thing is interesting. I don't think many people reported this, but we saw it from that very first study. We're seeing it very frequently with the stroke data that Amina talked about, and also other data sets as well. So it's an ongoing problem that the system is actually coming up with a probability of a certain diagnosis, and then coming up with a probability of a certain triage, but possibly the twain shall not meet. They're different parts in this really complicated network, and so that's kind of worrying. I think, because we want things to be consistent with the same problem in the same situation.
Yeah, and to add to his comment, so one of the other problems with testing these tools in low middle income countries is that these tools are tested via text. And the problem in low middle income countries is documentation. Most of these hospitals have not documented patient care or anything. So if we don't have the document to test this patient, we can actually test these tools. So some of the studies we are working on now is actually work with doctors in low middle income countries, collect like past exams, talk about like possible questions that are focused in like maybe in the African setting. And we try to test these models to see if it will actually answer the question. And it's for sometimes it does work, but in general, there's still a lot of work that's needed to be done.
Hey, so it would be interesting topic. I'm using AI to like clean up documentation, to take patient notes and things like that, and to, prepare like really well written statements and things like that. Seems really attractive. But the problem is that what about responsibility with the data? How do we know whether we can use it? Is it permissible? Like, for instance, if you're on a study section and you want to use it to summarize your notes for study section, that's not allowed. Age. So in the clinic, are they facing similar kind of?
So, I mean, I think there's been, some contracts and, some discussion about how to handle this, but it's still a work in progress, and there are concerns. So, Ross Hilliard used to work, Brown and actually now in the main medical center, was describing how they were looking to do a contract like a year or so ago with a company to do this ambient recording. So you have the microphone in the room that picks up both the physician and the nurse and the patient as well. And then it processes it through voice recognition, which is kind of relatively deterministic and produces a transcript. And then the transcript is then fed to the large language model like ChatGPT to actually generate a summary. So the different stages are quite important. And Ross said that initially the company said they were not going to give them the transcript. The company was going to keep the transcript for their own use. And so they would then end up with a summary generated by the large language model, but not know what the real data was that was collected, which I was like, no way. It's like a disaster, right? Because you don't know if you've got something wrong, you can't cross-check your stuff, and they have the data to cross-check you. So it just, there's some real concerns there. And I think
all of that information is now being recorded, then anything you say to your doctor is now part of that transcript.
It's a huge problem, yes. And we're seeing that, that information is then being sent to like Nuance as a big data center in Massachusetts, one of the leading companies, presumably hanging on to this data. And there's questions about how to do that. So regulation is very important.
Another question. Any questions online?
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you both. Break. I think we'll reconvene in 40 minutes. We're going to start back up. And we have with us joining us today, Eric Wells. Eric's from the Department of Epidemiology over the School of Public Health. And he's going to talk to us about some resources for data equity. Eric.
Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. So my name's Eric. So to get started, I wanted to highlight today that the resources we put together were part of a collaborative effort from the COBRE DRM core. The purpose of putting together these resources was to address one of our core aims, which is to provide direct support on best practices for self-assuring equity throughout all stages of research. This
Yeah. Oh, I know working.
So to ground ourselves a little bit before we get started, I did want to note that it's important as a research community that we raise the bar when it comes to preventing overdose death, specifically in Rhode Island. Prevent Overdose RI has published findings through 2024 that highlight that Black Rhode Islanders experience a higher rate of overdose deaths than both Hispanic and white Rhode Islanders. In correlation to that, Prevent Overdose RI also highlights that Black Rhode Islanders receive methadone far less than white Rhode Islanders. With just that very quick little bit of local context in mind, we also wanted to highlight that it's important to look at how race and ethnicity data have been historically measured across the US. The first census was established in 1790 and only included 3 different race categories. It took until 1977 for those first standards for race and ethnicity data collection to be established. Those standards were then not updated till 20 years later in 1997. Of note, though, that those 1997 standards don't include representation for folks from Middle Eastern and North African. 25 years later, it was announced in 2024 that the revisions listed here on the screen would be implemented. Those revisions include combining race and ethnicity into one question, adding representation for folks from Middle Eastern and North African countries, removing stigmatizing words such as majority and minority, and the addition of detailed data collection beyond the minimum standard. These changes were to be reflected across government surveys, forms, and the US Census with a proposed implementation timeline of about 18 months. Now, with the change in administration and the resignation of the director of the Census Bureau in January, it's a little uncertain if the changes will still be taking place. But I do want to highlight that there are still 5 more years before the 2030 census, and there'll be a test in 2026 and 2028 happening before that. The changes were actually open to public comment until this past Tuesday. So the next step will be that the Census Advisory Committee will be reviewing the changes in April. If you want to stay up to date on what changes might be happening, I posted the link here for reference. So with both the DRM core aims and a little bit of context in mind, we put together a library of resources specifically focused on equity and data. Here on the screen, you can see I posted the QR code if you'd like to access the library now. If not, it'll be posted again at the end of the slides, and also there's a hyperlink for when the slides are sent out. So the resources in the library range from articles, toolkits, and webinars to provide both a mix of mediums and engagement level. The resources are broken down into 5 different categories, which include the data lifecycle, best practices, evaluation, visualization, and dissemination. On the following slides, we're going to go through an example of each of them. So one example in the data lifecycle category is the Racial Equity Throughout Data Integration Toolkit from the AISP. This toolkit includes 6 comprehensive chapters, starting with planning and then going through the phases you see listed here all the way to dissemination. Each chapter includes guiding questions, positive practices, and a real-life example of the work in action. Outside of the 6 chapters, there's also 3 different activities that a researcher can complete. Activity 1, who should be at the table, helps outline how researchers can identify, assemble, and gather a group of diverse stakeholders. Activity 2, mapping assets and engaging the community, helps researchers develop an understanding of the local context. And activity 3, Identifying root causes through factor analysis helps researchers to identify factors and causes for observed outcomes in administrative. So as I mentioned, there's 6 different chapters covering the data lifecycle, and here you'll find an example of those positive practices from each of those chapters. On the left side of the screen is the default practice, and on the right side of the screen is the recommended practice from the resource. So for planning, the recommendation would be to establish deadlines that prioritize participation from community members. For collection, the AISP recommends having role-based staff that are trained in data collection. And for access, the recommendation is to have both transparent data release schedules and clear information on where data can be accessed. For statistics, the recommendation is to provide transparency in the design of the algorithm and testing process. For analysis, they recommend engaging local experts. And finally, for reporting, the AISP recommends creating a range of different products. So now we're going to shift one of our resources for best practices. The University of Illinois has established a guide for best practices. The first best practice is to thoughtfully consider race and ethnicity during study design. This may include indicating how race was measured and any limitations there were, such as were participants asked to self-identify. The second best practice is to treat racism as a fundamental cause for health inequalities when choosing methods and interpreting results. And the third is to acknowledge intersectional identities. So this may look like examining race at the intersection of gender, class, citizenship, and sexual orientation. A second best practice that I wanted to highlight was from the Massachusetts Department of Public Health, and they put together a roadmap. This roadmap is a 1-page infographic, so it's pretty easy to digest. And here I've highlighted just 2 of those key points. There are 7 key points that are highlighted in the roadmap. Next, we have a resource for evaluation, which is the Racial Bias in Data Assessment tool. This tool can be used to assess the risks of bias in a survey data set before conducting secondary analysis. This tool includes 25 different questions that are focused on design, approach, and data structure. I've included one example on the right side of the screen here. This particular question prompts the researcher to think about the implications of any geographic boundaries that you may have in your research. And then after answering the 25 questions, the researcher will reflect on an assessment of low, medium, or high risk of bias. Based on that risk, the tool will then provide a practical consideration for your research. A second resource for evaluation that I wanted to highlight is the guiding questions for supporting culturally responsive evaluation practices from the MDRC. This resource is an article that offers guiding questions throughout multiple phases of research. A few of those phases include project design, cost analysis, data collection, and data analysis. Here on the screen, I've included a short sample of some of the qualitative questions. In addition to these questions, the article also highlights that an equity-based perspective challenges us to go a step further and examine what projects we pursue and what questions we're asking. Next, we have a resource for visualization. Throughout this article, the author notes that we should all be considering language, colors, icons, shapes, and order within our research. For language, it's important to consider how we're using titles, text, and labels. For both colors and icons, it's important to follow contrast and accessibility guidelines while also not using color palettes that may reinforce gender or racial stereotypes. On the right side of the screen here, I've shown you an example from the article of how the colors have been updated from figure 2 to figure. When considering order, the Urban Institute recommends taking an active role when choosing how data labels appear within visualizations. This can apply to labels in tables, bars, and graphs. The article highlights that which group we choose to show first can affect how readers perceive the relationship or hierarchy between different groups. So a few of the recommendations from the author are listed here on the screen, which include considering which community is the focus of your study, considering what story you're trying to tell is, and finally considering the relationship between your groups when it comes to population size, sample size, and your group. Last but not least, we have a resource for dissemination, which is the steps towards distributing data products equitably by We All Count. This resource highlights that what you say, how you say it, and how your audience interacts with it matters. This principle is highlighted through 3 key steps within the resource. The first step is to choose a target audience in a way that reflects the equity that you aim for. The second step is to review your content, medium, and access, which we'll go into a bit more on the next slide. And the third step is to test out a variety of styles, mediums, and narratives directly with your target audience. So listed here on the screen are some of the examples from the content, medium, and access topic. So for content, you might want to consider what the subject of your content is and what tone you're using to tell your story. When thinking about medium, you may want to consider if your audience interacts more with a digital or a printed work, and if there'll be any interactive elements to that work. And for access, you'll want to consider factors such as, does your audience need to pay to see your work, or do they need to create an account to log in? So now that we've gone through a quick example of each of the resources, I do want to note that there are webinars also included in the library. These webinars are free to access via YouTube or Vimeo, and they're each about an hour. Before wrapping up, I did also want to highlight that there is an upcoming talk in the Racial Equity and Methodology series. This talk will be held virtually on April 17th at 12 p.m. with Manuel Cano. If you'd like to register for the event to get the Zoom link, you can do so at events.com. I also want to note that if you have any questions about this resource library, or again, if you need the link, you could reach out to me or Julia and put our contact information here on the screen. And then finally, again, here is the QR code if you didn't catch it the first time. And then when the slides are sent around, we also have QR or the links if you want.
Great. Thank you, Eric. Any questions for her? Again, if there's any online. In the chat.
And just one last comment that I'll make is that this library is kind of considered like a living library. So we're always considering new articles, webinars, or journals to add files.
Thanks again. Right.
We are like 15 minutes early.
Oh, okay. Next speaker, do we start the panel? I'm not sure the panel is here either. Yeah. Break.
Yeah. Researchers could introduce themselves and the ones who are here.
Oh, okay. Well, we're gonna do that as part of the networking, but we could do that right now and move things along. If folks that are here want to introduce themselves, and because I know the group will be here, I'm gonna start with them. Stephanie, can you just kind of maybe introduce yourself and COBRES that you're working with? And just kind of so we kind of know who's in the room and who are the early career faculty that.
Sure. So I'm Steph Ruest. I'm one of the pediatric emergency medicine faculty here. And I'm currently one of the research project leads working on a project with some computer science collaborators where we are using machine learning techniques to identify children with fractures who are likely abused compared to children who are not. So applying some of these complex methods that I have learned a lot about over the past few years, and come across some of the stumbling blocks that were presented here today. But it's been a pretty cool and eye-opening project over the past couple of years.
I'm Robin Wing, also pediatric emergency medicine attending at Hasbro. And I am one of the research projects leads for the injury control COBRE. And my project is using implementation science methods to implement a pre-intubation checklist for children in the emergency department who present with respiratory failure secondary to traumatic.
I'm Karen Jennings Mathis. I am part of the research project on Star COBRES. I am the second nurse practitioner at the hospital. And my project is looking at discrimination and how it influences health risk behaviors among the Black youth, considering the intersection of the United States. Clearly, our administration will fund.
Morning.
My name is Olin Liang. I'm with the Stem Cell and Aging COBRES. I have my own lab, but I run a lentivirus core to provide you with feasibility studies and reagents to run application. And I also run the cell and genome engineering shared resource for the Brown Cancer Center. I'm on the American Heart Association Career Development Award Council, so I can give you some details on the structure of career development.
Thank you. Morning.
I'm Sun Chen Wen, and from our stem cell agent. I'm running up and running the intracellular vesicle. We provide service for isolating the vesicles, cavitation of the vesicle, and others. Service for research in the field of the vesicle.
Okay.
My name is Brian Ashford. I'm the administrator of the Center for Neuromodulation at Butler Hospital. Dr. Greenberg, Dr. Carpenter.
Thank you.
Hi. Sorry, my name is Margot Martinez Moreno. I'm an area of teaching investigator, so I'm an assistant professor at the neurosurgery department. And I currently work in the epigenetic landscape of Cordoma, and I don't hold any COBRES for this today, but I'm a pilot project awardee for the Center of Computational Biology for the Brown University.
Very welcome. We met.
Hi, I'm Rubul Abid. I'm a faculty at Rhode Island Hospital. And then I have a cardiovascular disease research lab. My major focus is studying oxygen signaling in coronary vascular endothelium and how we can develop therapeutic model for recovery of myocardial ischemia using that. And here I'm for stem cell. I have a COBRES grant from stem cell and aging. So where I'm developing a model to bioengineer extracellular vesicles, stem cells, so that we can do systemic delivery to cardiovascular system or cardioneurosite actually, to see whether the difference between young and old age myocardial recovery.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Michelle Dawson. I'm an associate professor in MCB, and I'm working with the SCA Aging COBRA, and I have a project that's focused on extracellular vesicles in the context of age-induced extracellular matrix modifications in irradiated mice. I'm using the precision cut slice mouse model to look at the ECM modifications and how exosomes contribute to changes in the matrix.
I'm Julie Bromberg with the Injury Control COBRE.
Hi, I'm Ruby. I work at the Injury Control COBRE as a research assistant. I'm on same time.
I'm Tricia and I work at the COBRE for opioids and
Hi, my name is Rochelle Narski. Good morning. I'm an assistant professor at the Department of Psychiatry and Human Behavior. I'm also a research project leader at the COBRES Center for Sleep and Circadian Rhythm in Adolescents. And my research project is looking at the association between the oral microbiome, sleep, circadian rhythm, and depression among.
I'm Crystal Medeiros. I am the program administrator for the sleep med, pediatric mental.
Dr. Queensberry? Dr. Queensberry is PI for the Aging and Stem Cell COBRES.
Susan Dolaze, and I also work with your pulmonary and stem I'm Sharon Lee. I am part of the trauma and resilience part of the research scientist at the Center for Behavioral Medicine. My is a data analysis of interact with.
Thank you.
Jody Rich, PI of the program on opioids and overdose. We're open for business. We've got hiring projects. We've got project lead openings, and I think there's this opioid and overdose crisis in the U.S. is so pervasive. It has invaded so many parts of communities that there's probably opportunity to work with almost any of these. On our world.
Great, thanks. So getting back to our program, oh, did I miss something? What's our next speaker? So yes, Lauren, why don't you come on up? So Lauren Fletcher with University Library Services is going to talk to us about using those services for evidence-based science.
Do I use this to change my slide?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Hi, everybody. My name is Lauren Fletcher. I am officially the Medical Education and Clinical Engagement Librarian with Brown University Library with our Health and Biomedical Library Services. But equal to that is I am also the lead of our evidence synthesis support service. And so that is what we're going to be talking about today. I can't get into too many weeds or tips and tricks on how to do evidence synthesis since it's its own research methodology, but I want to highlight what services, big services, are available at the library for you to do these. So just a quick rundown of who we are. There are 6 people in our department. We have specializations from everywhere from medical education, open science, public health, general clinical, but all of us work together with all of the people we work with. So there's a chance you could work with me or one of my other partners. It really just depends. There are, how many? 4 of us on our evidence synthesis service. So myself, Laura Haygood, Hillary Krause, and Kelsey Sawyer. So if you do want to work with a librarian on an evidence synthesis project, you'll most likely be grouped with one of the 4 of us. Is it good for me to change slide? Yeah. Okay.
So sorry.
And I think you guys will have access to these afterwards, right?
Yes.
Okay. So at the bottom of the page is our direct email address. This will go to all 6 of us. So it's the fastest way to contact any of us because it goes to all 6. So one of us can get to you as fast as possible.
Sorry.
I swear I know how to do stuff like this. That way?
No, I think it's my fault.
There we go. Woo! What we do beyond traditional library services. So if you have access questions, need help getting a journal article, think we need a book or a journal or something else. Besides those normal librarian things, we also have a broad range of research support services. So the number one of that is going to be our evidence synthesis support service, but we also do independent one-on-one consultations. We have, you heard from Andrew Creamer earlier with his impact in data and how the library can assist with different data management plans and data purposes. So we do all of everything kind of all in between. So I just want to take a moment and step back and think about what actually is evidence synthesis. That is a broad terminology to talk about different types of review articles. So generally speaking, when I'm talking about evidence synthesis, we're looking at systematic reviews with meta-analyses, scoping reviews, rapid reviews, and umbrella reviews. Those are the main types of reviews that we're talking about in this. Just a raise of hands, has anyone done any one of these types of reviews? Oh, yeah, a couple of us. I have too, yay. If you want to learn more about the different types, there is our citation at the bottom. This is what we give out to everyone if they want to learn a little bit more about the various types of reviews. This is from Grant and Booth. It's an old article, but it's a staple, it's a key. So if you want to know a little bit more about some of these, feel free to look at that article or reach out to me and I can give you access to it. So main characteristics of any evidence synthesis project are going to be a very well-defined research question that follows an appropriate framework or guideline. I cannot read that list. All right. A formal protocol, just like you would with doing any other type of research methodology. We want to have a protocol for our systematic review or evidence synthesis project. You want to have a well-researched, well-documented, comprehensive expert search strategy to locate all relevant literature. Preferably that search is done in combination with the librarian to make sure it is as comprehensive as possible. You need to be searching in more than one database, more than 2 databases, minimally 3 databases. You need to use predefined inclusion and exclusion criteria throughout your study process. You need to be looking at risk of bias and study quality, depending on which review type you select, and then synthesize your findings. So that's a very short way of describing a process that typically takes anywhere between 8 to 2+ years. So very simple process to survive a very long period of time. Review projects are not something just to do because you have a few months of extra time. That's not enough time to do a review project appropriately. So really think about, if you want to undertake an evidence synthesis project, think of this as a large scale review research methodology that you would be undertaking just like any other pilot study or observational study, anything else of that nature. So I just want to highlight some of the main steps in the evidence synthesis process. So they kind of go back and forth between 1 and 10. Please feel free to use this in the future. I really like this one. My colleague found it. It's pretty nice and simple to read. But why do you want a librarian? What do we bring to the picture? Ultimately, we bring expert searching knowledge and how to build those searches, how to write those searches, and how to search in each of those individualized databases. We are also methodological experts. All of us on our team have done a variety of different review types. All of us have had a variety of different review types published. So we know the process from drafting your question to publication. We have multidisciplinary knowledge. And again, we're helpful in all of the major steps of the review process, but mainly, importantly, search strategy, database strategy adoption, searching and documentation, and then how to manage your results. Those are our core areas of where we take on the expertise within the review team, not everyone else on the review team. So our Hubble's evidence synthesis service, we try and keep this just to evidence synthesis types. again, we're a small team of expert librarians, there's only 4 of us. So with that, we are pretty much always on a wait list for assistance. We'll talk about our levels next, but just be aware that we are almost always on a wait list because it's a very popular service and there's only 4 of us. We have 2 tiers of service. So one is a consultation level and the other one is a co-author level. On the who's eligible, everybody. Students, faculty, staff of Brown, our affiliated hospitals, all of our clinical, everyone is associated, basically. We do have one restriction in that if you are working with a student, this is more specifically to you guys in the classroom. If you are working with students or a student and in the project, the review is for a grade or for a course, we will not do a co-author level. We feel it important that the students learn from the opportunity. So we only work with students for graded degree required things in a consultation capacity. But if anyone, including students, is doing something not graded or not for a degree, we will do co-author level for anyone. So what do these get you? That's the important thing. Consultation level is our lowest level. It's more of an education-based level where we help teach the team about methodology, about research questions, how to develop a search, how to search in databases. But the librarians do not create the search. The librarians do not perform the search. This is usually 2 to 3 hours worth of consultations, if even that much. But that's usually where we keep it at for consultations. Co-author levels come with a lot more impact and a lot more hands-on working collaboration because the librarian is a member of the review team. We can complete these types of things. So methodological guidance, we create the searches, we translate the searches, we run the searches, we control data records, we put things into software programs, which I'll talk about in a minute. We can write a particular section of the methods and the manuscript. We review and edit the final manuscript as well. And then we can also assist with some of these other options. So protocol development, question development, full text retrieval, locating risk of bias tools, developing data extraction templates, etc. We do have an intake form. You should theoretically, if you want to use us, put in the form somewhere between the 2 and 3 step. Again, we're on a wait list. Generally, even for consultations, it usually takes us a couple of days to even be able to do that. Right now, for review, co-author level, we are on about a month to possibly 2-month wait time. So the earlier you can get a form in, if you know you want to do something, the better, the more chance you have to work in an appropriate time frame. Our intake form right now just generally asks you what's your review question. Do you know what type of review you want to do? Have you written a protocol? You do not have to at this point, but if you have, let us know. Do you have defined eligibility criteria? And then give us 3 to 5 articles that you think would be in this review. That'll help us start getting started on that search development process. So some other resources that are not just librarians. We have built out a review guide that goes through a bunch of information. The first page is going to have all the information I just said about our service and our intake form. We also have information on there about the major review types with methodology for you to follow, generalized information in there. We also have some step-by-step guidance on the major processes of doing a review. So if you don't know what step 15 or not 15, 10 is, you could look up in the guide to let you know what that is. We also have some direct links to major reporting guidelines like Prisma. And we also have link out to major areas for you to submit your protocols, either Prospero for systematic reviews or Open Science Framework for scoping reviews. Additional resources is the small list of the databases that we have. So most major databases that would generally be searched in any type of evidence synthesis, we have access to. We also have access to a broad range of gray literature information. So this could be clinical trial registries or government websites, etc. And then lastly, our biggest tool to utilize for evidence synthesis is Covenants. Raise a hand if anyone's ever heard of Covenants. A few. It's super powerful. It's the greatest tool I've used for systematic reviews, and I've used quite a few at different places. So Covenants is an online software platform that can be used on a computer, on a tablet, or on your cell phone. It's just mobily optimized, so there's not an app you have to download. You can manage and streamline the entire review process pretty much, from screening all the way to finalizing a Prisma diagram and data extraction and risk of bias. There's customizable data extraction templates and risk of bias templates. You can work with collaborators outside of Brown, importantly, and you can all work asynchronously at the same time. So just some quick images of what Covenants looks like and what it really does. So it does the review process from screening forward. So review question, protocol development, search strategy, all that's done separately. Generally, if you're working with a librarian as a co-author, what we do is we'll do all the searching, we'll get all the citations, and then we will put them into Covenants for you and create this for you. We invite everyone you'd want to be on the review for you. So all you guys have to do is go in and get started. So this is what the first general screen kind of looks like. You can see, you can look at imported references, title and abstract screening. The entire team can see through this. Let's go to the next screen. You can kind of see what this looks like for title and abstract screening. It is blinded between each other, so it does follow all methodological guidance. Yes, no, maybe on abstracts, they automatically either go into no, or they go to the next level, which is exactly what you'd want them to do. For full text screening, we can upload and help you upload the full text in here so you can look at full text inside Covenants. That way you don't have to go back and forth between platforms. It automatically asks you to give a reason for why you're excluding in full text, which again, follows methodological guidance. These are editable, so if this is not the right kind of things for your review, edit this list up and make it exactly what you want it to say. Anything that makes it through full text automatically goes into data extraction, which is super nice. We've already uploaded the PDF. So you can data extract with your PDF right next to you the entire time. These forms are editable, so they can be literally anything you want to take out of them, but your PDF is right there with you. Same thing happens with risk of bias. Ooh, I didn't show that screen, but it looks exactly the same for risk of bias. So there's lots of different risk of bias tools out there. You can create the customized risk of bias tool template to match anything out there. So you can do it all within this. All data and data extracted and risk of bias can be downloaded into a CSV. You can then manipulate that data however you see fit or put it into a meta-analysis software. And then it builds out a Prisma diagram for you, so you don't have to worry about that. And the librarian doesn't. And it's all nice and pretty, and you can download it and just copy and paste it into your manuscript. We love it. And that's all I have for you guys today. Very short and sweet. I can take any questions if we have time. I have business cards with me, and you can also send us some emails. Yes.
I have a question specific for both Covenants.
Yeah.
In regards to when you're doing the inclusion exclusion criteria, I had encountered this a couple of years ago in which if people enter data, if they use a capital letter versus lowercase, if there's a conflict,
yes,
it had to be resolved. Have they fixed that?
No.
Okay.
As far as I know, no.
Which is the
kind of annoying. Yeah. So what it's going to do, it very clearly takes it, whatever you put in is exactly what it thinks you put in versus what someone else does. So methodology states that throughout data extraction and risk of bias, that needs to be done independently by 2 reviewers with consensus. If you put a capital letter versus a lowercase letter, it will think that that's not consensus. So what I've advised teams to do to kind of ignore that is have as many things be a bullet, like a selection, a multiple choice selection as possible. That way you don't run into that as much, and try and leave the stuff that you write out or with letters or numbers to be really specific. That way you're not having to look as many of those silly disagreements and consensus things as possible.
Thank you.
Yes.
Not sure how long you've been doing this. I like the two-tier level, and I think it's, good to have you guys in office.
Yeah.
How many, is it working? Are you getting a lot of publication?
I think so. I mean, I've been at Brown for 3 years. And since I've been here, I've had 6 or 7 published. But previously I had some other ones. We're actually, fun news, going to be updating our service tiers coming soon. So be on the lookout. We're actually going to move to like a 3-tier service. So giving some intermediary help between consultation and co-author level. So be on the lookout for some updates coming soon and an updated form. Just trying to get us to streamline our process a little bit better for you all and for us.
Yeah. I'm thinking that one strategy might be this initial low level and then.
Exactly. We kind of figured most people are going to need that initial consult level and make a decision from there if they want to go further.
It's just quick.
Yes. That's the goal, right? And if you can convince them, if they want to give us more money for another person, we're always for that. We love that. But I think my time's done. If you guys would like a card, please let me know. I'm just going to keep them over there. Thank you all for having me, and I look forward to working or seeing you guys in the future.
I think we're still a little ahead of schedule. You can be on the panel. Here, I know Rebecca Owens here. Leslie is there, right? Yeah.
You just get started with what we have and
Yeah, maybe we will. Why don't you come on up and we'll get started. Same here. We're expecting one other. See ya. And I'm just gonna let her keep it.
I think so, yeah. You want to,
So, I'm sorry.
do you mind just advancing the next slide?
So, the next section, we're going to talk a little bit about mentorship. And as our investigators or early career faculty, they will be starting mentoring others. And, really it's kind of a change from going from a mentee when you're a part of the COBRE, and most of those are mentored projects, and then moving on to being a mentor. And we're gonna have some of our experts here for their opinions, as well as they've kind of facilitated that move. But let me have them introduce themselves first. If you can kind of introduce yourselves, say like which COBRE you've been part of, and then maybe what kind of mentees you have right now in your mentee portfolio. Are they, postdocs, are they faculty, are they students?
Hi, I'm Leslie Brick. I'm the Associate Director of the Quant Sciences Program and an Associate Professor at Brown in the Department of Psychiatry and Human Behavior. And I was originally part of the injury COBRE, And they funded a pilot project of mine that I quickly submitted as an R01, and it got funded before I could really do much on the COBRE itself. But I definitely benefited from that early mentorship from the COBRE, but also from a lot of my mentors along the way. So right now I have an R01 from NIDA that I'm MPI with Nicole Nugent on, and we have 3 research assistants who are bachelor's level. So I consider myself a mentor to them. I have 1 postdoc who submitted an F32 that was awarded, that's actually attached to the R01. He's in his first year and will be starting his second year. And then I also mentor some folks on the suicide T32 at Brown as well. So I have kind of a couple of research assistants, a couple of postdocs. I've mentored 2 other postdocs who finished up and are now faculty. And then I'm also a mentor on several K awards. So for junior faculty.
Great, thanks. So Jared, thanks for joining us. We're just doing an introduction, who you are, what COBRE you're part of, and then sort of what your mentee portfolio looks like right now.
Sure. I apologize for my falling into my chair in the middle of introductions. So my name is Jared Salatin. I'm associate professor of psychiatry, and I'm a core director of Bradley Hospital's sleep and circadian rhythms and child and adolescent mental health core. And I'm really glad Leslie mentioned mentorship of post-bac RAs, because I think oftentimes we don't talk about people that we employ as mentees, but they really are. So my mentor profile, I do a little bit of everything. So I have 4 postbacks who work under me. Some of them are on R01 driven studies. Some of them are part of our COBRE Center. I view them as mentees, as trainees, and we spend a lot of time thinking about how their couple years with us is a stepping stone to where they want to be. I also sit on some graduate student dissertations as an advisor. I have a full-time postdoctoral fellow. I share a postdoctoral fellow with another mentor. I mentor psychology, clinical psychology resident students. One the past year, one this year, one next year. They just matched, so that's always a fun engagement in the lab. In addition, through our COBRE role, I do a lot of junior faculty. So I'm direct mentor on a couple of research projects, engaged in the COBRE. Some of that predates when I was a core director, and then also as a core director, we spent just a lot of time helping you get where they need to get. So mentoring is really part and parcel to my day at really every level. Oh, and undergrad honors thesis. So happy, really.
My name is Olin Liang. I'm associate professor of medicine in the division of hematology and oncology. Many years back, I joined a stem cells and aging COBRE phase 2. Went through that 5 years, and then during the final years of phase 2, I developed a core facility to offer the lentivirus construction service, and actually put that into phase 3 as a core of the phase 3. And now I have a number of R1s, recently received another one. And I have 3 junior faculty mentees. They're physician scientists, and they are also successfully funded recently, big or small. And I have 5 research scientists in my lab. They're all PhDs. And in addition to my own lab research program, I also direct the cell and genome engineering shared resource of Brown Cancer Center. And I also serve on the American Heart Association Career Development Award Committee. So I have a very clear structure, how much you should view at this stage, how you structure your career development. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. Well, I can see you all doing lots of mentorship. and a lot of folks that seeking out your services. I'm guessing there's probably other people that looking for mentorship too. But I'm just kind of wondering, how do you prioritize, how do you kind of manage that so it's not overwhelming? One, that you can give the time the mentee needs, you can give that time to that person, but also you can protect your time to do the other work that you need to do this part of your career. Leslie, you want to start us off again?
That's the golden question. I think it's always a balance, and I think it's a ever evolving question for me. And I think I try and approach when somebody approaches me, I try and find a way to help them at whatever level that might be, whether it's working really closely with them or giving them some kind of broad advice. But I think over my career, that's changed a lot. And as I've gotten senior, more further along, I've been able to balance it. And I think a lot of times what helps is finding, common interests and common grounds with who you're mentoring so that it feels more fun and rewarding. So yeah, I don't know. I think it's always hard to juggle your interests versus your mentees. I think the other part that I take with me is I've had some really great mentors in my life, and I've also had some really not as great mentors. And so I try and find that balance for myself where I feel like maybe somebody didn't do as good job with me. Maybe I can learn from that and approach it differently for my trainees and my mentors. And then the mentors who I've had who've done a really great job, I try and strive toward being and bringing that with me. But I do think I don't know that, maybe somebody else can fill in here. I don't know that ever just gets solved. I think as you go through your career, there's always competing demands. And so part of what makes this job exciting is having to always kind of navigate that and learn along the way.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything Leslie said. I think, my graduate mentor, I think I was his first graduate student, second, but we all came in at the same time. So it was a really junior mentor. And then my postdoc mentor, very senior mentor, seen a lot of people. And so I think, there is a growth in mentoring trajectory. And in retrospect, I look back on sort of, working with a really junior person versus working with a senior person, understanding that they navigate this world differently. And I think, as Leslie indicated, as we've grown up and become mentors, we've sort of tried to find that middle path. And, for me, communication is really crystally important because I spend a lot of time working with mentors and mentees to understand, or the mentees rather, to understand that, but the arrangement that we set up, we first rotate into the lab is not a contract. It's not a immovable object. That, as their interests change and our interest changes and our dynamic evolves, that sort of social contract between mentor and mentee starts to change. And so we do a lot of reevaluation. And a lot of continual conversation. And so without it being too much structure, and I think finding that balance is what makes it dynamic for us, makes it mentees, it relies on feedback from the mentees to keep it going. There are mentees that have standing meetings single week. Yes, they take a block out of time, but it's critical for their growth. And then at certain points, they pull back a little bit and say, well, this time is here for you, whether if you want it. You might not use it this week, and it's relying on the mentee to ask for it. So transitioning from structure to backstop, but not sort of forefront sort of structure, I think helps with the life cycle of the mentee, right? And that makes room for the next generation to come in where maybe your attention has to be a little bit more structured as the senior mentees sort of start being a little more self-sufficient, but always being there for them in the background. And so balancing that is really critical. And I think the other piece is junior in your career, it's, you're looking to develop those skills. So you sort of say yes to every opportunity and everyone that walks in the door. And then now starting to think a little bit about am I really the right fit for you? Is this the right fit? You know, happy to have conversations, happy to chat about it, but am I the right fit as a mentor, or is there someone else that serves you a little bit better? And becoming slightly more selective in when you say yes to the relationships.
Thanks. So, Owen, what do you think? I mean, how do you take people into your lab and make that decision?
Right, so the ultimate goal for this relationship, mentor-mentee, is for the mentee to succeed, right? So you have to choose a mentee that has the most potential. That's determined by commitment, diligence, and productivity. Those are the three criteria I look. So commitment, do you really commit to this career? How diligent do you work? What was your productivity? So as a candidate yourself, count for 30% of this process. Mentor, the team of mentors counts 35%, if you want to write that down. The research you do counts 30%. The ability you can explain your science at Thanksgiving dinner counts for 5%, right? So if you have this structure, then you know you're a good candidate. And I know whether you're a good candidate, right? So you come to me, what is a good fit? I judge you, you judge me. In order to judge me, you see my track record. How was my funding track record? How is it current funding track record? Because I have to guarantee a space for you to work in my lab. How many mentees I have, how successfully do they do, then you judge on me. So mutual assessment, then we decide if this is a good fit. So I don't waste my time on you. You don't waste your time on me. All right?
Sure. Thank you. So let's go back to something Jared was talking about. I mean, it is somewhat dynamic. Things change, people's interests change. How do you kind of continue to assess that your expectations are aligning with the expectations of the mentee of what kind of success looks like for them, and that they're in the right place, you know, working with you as they're. I think, Jared, you know, you said there's no kind of contract, but do you guys use anything that's written down? Do you kind of say, okay, these are our goals for this year, this 6 months, whatever? Do you kind of go through that process with your mentees? Maybe we'll start with you all.
So from my point of view, I think because I've gone through this process, I know what opportunities are there. So for example, beginning of the year, perhaps look at Rhode Island Foundation, whether you have opportunity. In April, Physicians Inc. have funding opportunity. By June, perhaps you submit R21. So I see the structure of the year. I can give you advice. When do you feel comfortable to put in your grant or any funding request? So ultimately, I think the only criteria for me for successful mentee is they get funded. That's all.
So do you, when they start with you, do you say, this is the timeline you're expected to put in a grant, you know, in the next 6 months, year, whatever?
Absolutely. So when you have a due date, you start working. It's, you know, but even you have a due date, you don't work like 6 months ahead of that. You work almost 3 months to that date. You start working. So by 3 times, what is your draft that I want to spend time on you? So time is very precious. We really have to be effective with this structure. Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of different tools that people use to write stuff down. There's individual development plans, there are mentor-mentee contracts, there are, goal documents, and I think those are only as worth. They can either be very helpful or they can be worth the paper. And I think the difference is if you do that exercise, it could be a really productive hour together. You write down the goals, think about what is attainable versus what is ambitious, and what is sort of, what are the benchmarks that are going to get you to where you, because, we all know in our subfields, like, yeah, this fellowship would be really great to apply to, or you're going to need a trainee award, this conference that's going to set you up this way. But if you write all of that down in July and then you never look at that paper again, I find it not that particularly helpful. And so we do quite a bit of reevaluation and making sure that our meetings, our mentor-mentee meetings, are not just about product, but that they actually reevaluate where we are in the trajectory. Because if the mentee's goals have changed, I'm not a clinical psychologist, I'm a research funded faculty. So my pathway was postdoc to a K award, to a COBRES project, to an R01. And, that's the trajectory we know. And a lot of people come in and they pick their mentor because they want to find the path that their mentor took. But if you start deviating from that, we have to adapt dynamically and make sure that you are connected with the voices that know those other paths, because I might not know those other paths, and make sure that you get connected in those ways. And so, for instance, psychology internship is a really interesting training program because it's rapid. It's 1 year, you're in and you're out. I see you for 4 hours a week. How are we going to make good on that 4 hour a week research rotation? I do put strict expectations at the very beginning. I said, 4 hours a week, what can you do? You can do a conference abstract. It's the deadline's in December. It fits nicely in the year. You come in July, you do some work, you submit a conference abstract. And then what you do in the springtime depends on where you're going next. So if you decide that you're going to do a postdoc and stay here, well, maybe we expand that project a little bit. If you're going to do a postdoc and leave, well, then can we get that into a manuscript that's not too much intensive for you to write? If you're going to leave academia, go different. I look at the year, or I look at the 2 year, or whatever the scope of time we have together, and think, where can we find some benchmarks for success so that regardless of whatever happens, you walk out with a product? And then where are the opportunities for exploration and discovery? And we might go in different directions and it evolves. But so, like in all things, it's a balance between structure and agility.
Yeah, I really, I share that same sentiment of like being really flexible with people, and my research interests are also in individual variability. But every mentee you work with is at a different phase, and they have different interests, they have different strengths, they have different weaknesses. And so, one of my goals when I work with somebody, especially formally, is to get a sense of what their goals are, because I think at the end, what really matters to them is that they're meeting the goals that they set for themselves. And if those goals change, which they often do as you learn and grow, then I want them to be comfortable to like approach me and say, hey, I really thought I wanted this for my career, but I don't think that's what I really want to do. And a lot of the times that when I've seen trainees really struggle is when they're trying to meet the goals of other people or the expectations of other people. So I think it's really important for communication with the mentee and making sure that they're comfortable telling you when their goals are changing, and what those goals are. Because if they are on a different trajectory than you, that's okay. You may not be the right person to give them every piece of information. And so that helps you help them better. When communication is clear, when goals are clear, self-evaluating those goals. I like to have my trainees at whatever level I'm formally mentoring them, self-evaluate themselves before we meet. And then often what we do is we sit down and we say, okay, what did you say your strengths were? And what did you say the places you want to grow are? And then a lot of times my evaluation of them meets up with their self-evaluation. And so this is especially really great with my research assistants who are a little bit lower, and sometimes they need more feedback. And I have found many, many times that they often identify the areas that they're weakest or they need growth. And so it really helps to have their own reflections kind of guide the conversation. And I think that builds a lot of trust and communication so that when, you know, when they're telling me how they're doing and what their plans are, I can best help them.
You know, we're working with our mentees developing skills, and those skills could be laboratory skills, those could be data analysis skills, but there's more to mentorship than that. There's sponsorship, there's getting them involved in networks, and helping them with their career. You work with your mentees around that.
Thanks for bringing that up. I think ultimately the most important is a firm commitment from your department chair. If you have a firm commitment of your department to support your development, then you have a good chance. If you don't have that firm commitment, then perhaps you have to seek alternatives. That's what I make clear with the mentee.
And how about kind of getting them involved with other folks, either nationally, you know, societies, getting them on study section, whatnot.
I think, well, I think that is, you know, that's the stuff that costs us nothing, right? And, you know, when you're, and it's also one of the benefits when we have really senior mentors, that really junior mentors, which is one of the reasons why multiple mentors. But, you know, I do a lot of that. Your sleep research is a very small field, so it's beneficial in that respect. You know, if you get invited to write a chapter, you know, the mentee should be involved. If you get invited to do reviews, you know, mentored reviews are ways that, you know, even, yes, it's work for the mentee, but then their name is seen by the editor. They, you know, you start to circulate their name, which might not be otherwise as seen. You know, I've encouraged mentees to take on service, which again, carves a little bit of their time off, but exposes them to the broader field, especially if they're new to our field. And our field is particularly welcoming for trainees. There's also trainee service opportunities that basically have very limited work scope. So it's a nice return on investment, but it introduces you to a broader group. And so, you know, that I think is a big part of sort of the outside work of mentoring, which is getting you integrated and building and scaffolding a community that they might not have otherwise been exposed to.
Right, so the American Heart Association put it as a requirement in the Career Development Award application. You have to have at least one mentor, co-mentor in the team of mentors that is outside of your institution. So it's a structured way to force you reach out to others. That's very good. The second thing is that seek opportunity to be a junior reviewer on a study section. So right now, it's very encouraged that in a formal study section, you have 2 or 3 junior investigators that to train in the review process. If you can get on that list, it's very helpful. So you know the insider story, how grants are reviewed.
Yeah, I couldn't second that more. I served on a couple study sections as a postdoc or as a junior faculty member, not in the formal early career program, although now I'm a standing member. But there is the formal early career research training program that NIH runs that is an incredible program because you get very limited work, you get 1 or 2 applications. So it's not a heavy lift, but you get trained, you see it. And we modeled in our society, our professional society, we actually run grant reviewer trainings because if you understand how the grants get reviewed, it makes you a better grant writer. And exposing trainees to that process I think is incredibly worthwhile. So there is the formal ECR program, and I encourage.
Another way that I have integrated, especially postdocs who are kind of in this zone of needing to secure their own funding and thinking about how they're gonna, develop a network. I do a lot of statistical consulting on grants, and so oftentimes there's more requests than I actually have time for, and so I use that as often an opportunity to work my trainees into some of my professional networks, and then that gives them some experience in grant writing. A lot of times we will like meet with the investigative team to see kind of what needs they have, what they're looking for. And then I work with the postdoc to do a lot of the writing or the analytic plan or the analyses of the power calculation, supervised. And then over time, they get more and more confident. And then eventually I don't need to supervise them. And they can have those skills to take with them when they network as well. And so it both gives them the skills that I'm hoping to pass on, but also allows them to network with some, national level and sometimes international level.
Now, I think a couple of you mentioned working with Proctor. And if you could comment on maybe one lesson you learned from a good mentor you had, one lesson you learned from a bad mentor. And also comment, did you ever go through mentorship training?
Sure, I can jump off. So I did go through mentorship training, the advanced CTR mentorship program, the 8-week program. I did that before I took on any formal leave, so I encourage folks to do it. I had extremely good mentors, and I had a couple mentors that on the whole I don't view as strong, but particular strengths. And then even the good mentors had some deficiencies in their mentoring. So I don't think it's as clear as a binary state, but like a good lesson. Sponsorship, you already talked about. Mentors that are going to think about you, as part of their network and put you in front of people. And that can be as simple as CCing into an email. That can be as simple as looping you into a Zoom meeting. That can be actually introducing you to some mentors that make that space for you. That's always there. I really like the approach that my postdoc mentor had, which is we had a standing hourly meeting every week that was on her calendar, but it was up to me to use it. So if I didn't send her an agenda, she cleared her calendar the night before, but it was always there. I could always claim that time. So you have support that's unmovable, but without the pressure. Versus I've had some mentors where when they get busy, you can't meet with them. And I often think, and I remember what that felt like as a trainee and feeling like, wait a second, just because you're busy, I'm drowning here. I need to meet. And so I try to never put my mentees into that worry that, no matter how busy we get, if I have to cancel something, there's always an understanding of it being made up, right? It's not I'm too busy to meet with you. Say, hey, we're going to slide this to here. And so I try to take those two lessons of giving structure without too much overbearing structure so that they feel like they have a rubber to meet them, even if it's not seen always.
So personally, I never had a formal career development trainee, but it's important that I create opportunity for myself. It's also important. I spent many years in the Harvard system. I went through Harvard Stem Cell Institute. Competition is extremely hard. Meet on Saturday morning, 8 o'clock for lab meetings. So those environments, you're almost invisible. There are too many outstanding trainees in the group. So the only way you can stand out is create your own opportunity in that environment. So if you can carve out a niche of science of your own to create your own opportunity to be your own mentor as well.
I think there's a couple of themes that I've heard come up here, and one of them is this idea of having multiple mentors. And I definitely encourage that of people, because no one person can be everything to you. And so, you know, I try and be transparent about, you know, the limitations of the perspective that I'm coming from when I give advice, and the fact that I may not be right, and that it's good to sometimes talk to other people who are also successful, because having multiple perspectives is usually better than having one. And along that note, you know, like I said, no one person can give you everything. And so what I have tried to do in my own situations with my mentors, you know, I've had stronger ones and I've had less strong ones, but what I try and take from every one of them is identifying, you know, what were they able to give me? And even the ones that maybe I didn't feel as strongly about, I'm able to kind of like take some lesson from them. And so the best mentors I've had, I think, consistent kind of what Jared is saying, is I felt like they genuinely cared about me and they thought about me and they put me forward. And they did these things that don't cost anything to them, but shows me that they're genuinely, they have my best interests at heart. And so that's kind of like, you know, best case scenario, you have a mentor who really genuinely cares about your progress and that you're meeting your goals and all that. And then the ones that are less strong, you know, we're all human. And so sometimes it's a matter of personalities. Like, you know, my mentorship style may not be best for everybody. And likewise, you know, Jared may be, you know, better for other people. So I think I try and also approach just the whole mentorship thing as a matching of, you know, what is your style and what is my style? And can we figure out the best way forward? And can I give you the pieces that I need to give you and help you get to where you need to go? And then is there something else you need? Is there another mentor who can help fill in the gaps that I can't fill in? And so I try and really, you know, team science, I take very seriously, because one person can't do it all. So that applies to mentorship as well.
And one of the things our department has instituted, which I think is brilliant, are non-evaluative mentors. So yes, you have secondary mentors, but those often the co-mentors have as much stake in you and your work as the primary mentors. And so having non-evaluative people whose relationship to you is nothing other than a voice in a room and someone to talk to, I think I didn't have as a postdoc. The postdocs have now. I think it's incredible because it gives that different perspective of someone who's not your boss, not your lab manager, not your funder, stake in the game, just there to talk to you. And I get that, and I'm actually serving as one of those now. And I think it's been really enjoyable because it takes the pressure off of us too as the mentors. And, you know, there is no work to talk about. It's just, how are you doing? You know, what opportunities are you taking advantage of? Do you feel like you have the resources you need? Are there doors I can open for you that aren't being opened? And so, you know, seeking these mentors can be in very formalized roles that have money attached to them, and then can be very informally and just someone who you trust and someone who takes an interest in your career.
I think that's important too, especially when there's a mismatch between the mentor and the mentee, because it gives the mentee, you know, a person that they might be able to go to if they have concerns. They know they're not being evaluated, so there's that kind of power dynamic isn't there for them. So yeah, I think, you know, kind of setting up structure so that it's okay if it doesn't work out. You know, not everybody is made for each other, but giving mentees, you know, support in other ways that give them an out, and a way to talk to somebody else.
Jared, I want to thank you for the plug for the Advanced CTR mentorship training course. And, you know, it is something that the Advanced CTR has run now. It was 2017 when we started. I'm part of the group that runs that course. We've trained over 250 faculty so far, but it is something that's open to all faculty, Brown, URI, the VA. So if it's something that you think you're ready to move on to, please join us. Our next session will be in July. Our next course, we usually run the course twice a year. We have varying formats, both online and in person. You did it when you did it, but
it was the pandemic, so it was all online, but incredibly helpful. I might want to do it again.
Well, actually, we have the online community now, where you need, so, heard enough from me. Well, let's open it up for questions. Yes.
Question about the methods. And so, like, there's the latest methods that you could spend a lot of money on. Like, for the pilot, small amount of money, and you buy mice, you pay for people to work in the lab, you buy reagents, and then you also do like some latest technologies. How do you find the balance? How do you new technology? How do you get the RON funded? You know, yeah.
I think in that case, the best way is to collaborate because you don't have the expertise, you don't have resource, or even the instrumentation. I think if you collaborate with the expert who had all that, whereas you provide the theme for them to have a purpose into the mutual interest.
I think that's really good advice. And, you know, my research core does a lot of instrumentation and putting instruments in hands of pilot projects and research projects. Some of those, you know, we have to think about what's the scope of the pilot, what's the goal, right? Because the goal of a pilot is often to get the big, right? So being very targeted about it. Are we after feasibility? Are we after demonstration of concept? Are we after even a paper, or are we not? Are we just after some snippets of proof of concept? That's going to change how much I put in your hands. It's going to change how much involvement the core is going to have. And this balancing act between training you to be the expert and accelerating you to do the pilot so that you can then go get the grant. I mean, that's the balance. And, you know, the hope is that through all of these mechanisms that we have, that the community grows. And I think the product of that is that you're not in it alone, right? So it's you get this pilot award for a year. You're not writing an R01 with just you on the masthead, right? As Leslie said, it's team science, and that's going to be the people that are in these cores and that you collaborate with. So it's getting you into the team, bringing your perspective, enriching the team, but then using and leveraging the team to grow you, right? So you're not in it alone in that respect. You don't have to set up 100% independence on all of these methods just to get to the next stage. That's why it's about getting you into the fabric so that you can grow from there.
The nice thing about collaboration too is that you can discover the pieces that you want to integrate into your work, and then the pieces that you're happy with somebody else just doing.
Yeah.
Because there's definitely things that I've thought I've really wanted to do. And then once I got into the nitty-gritty, I'm like, you know what? I can just have a collaborator do that part.
Someone else could do
Yeah,
that.
like I like this work, but not enough to be on the ground doing it. And so sometimes you learn that in a pilot project or with a collaborator, and then it can, you know, help you isolate exactly what you want to grow your expertise.
Thank you for joining us. That's okay.
Apologies for being late. We have another symposium going. I just gave a talk. It was just late, so I'm so sorry.
That's fine. No worries. Maybe you could just introduce yourself and tell us, you know, which COBRE you've been associated with, and maybe a little bit about who your mentees look like now. You know, what stage of career they're in.
Okay, so I'm part of the I'm currently associate professor of medicine. I had joined Brown back in 2014, recruited by Dr. Quisenberry. Became a part of COBRE 2014. And since I think it was absolutely transformative for my career. And currently also I am a co-leading a cancer biology program with the Melagorata Cancer Center. And I'm also a co-director of pathobiology project program. So maybe you have another person who cannot say no to things. But I think these leadership roles think gave a lot of insight and are ways to give back.
Asking the audience a question, but yeah.
Hello, I'm Kristen from the Center for Neuromodulation, and COBRES offer a little bit of funding or support for the mentors through the admin store. Are there any other funding sources for mentees that can secure some effort of their mentors, whether it be department or through some type of administration fund? Having a protected effort support, I think, is helpful. But are there any other funding resources that mentees have to support them?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I will say, we fund our mentors, our research project leader mentors as well. And that was kind of unusual because, I mean, for 25 years, and I don't think I have ever got any funding whatsoever. And it's usually just kind of assumed you do it, but no funding's attached to it. But I'd be interested to know if the panel, has other mechanisms for receiving funding.
So I feel that the funding is going to be, for this specific role, is going to be always an issue. And I feel that this is unusual that COBRES is funding to ensure really that there is mentoring in place. It's just not on the paper. And then you have a real commitment. But I feel that there are other ways to secure the mentor network. And I feel that through COBRES, there are mechanisms to, just like for the graduate students, there is this thesis committee. So I feel that there are mechanisms to really engage several faculty, senior faculty members to help you. And it can be done formally through, through COBRE administration, or, support you with you reaching out to the individuals and form this kind of an informal committee to guide you, because and typically I would say that I've done this for myself. I reached out to multiple members of the faculty that are senior level, and really using their expertise for either career development questions or for scientific questions. So I feel that we have to be a little bit more proactive, and typically nobody said ever no. Like if you approach someone, would you be my mentor? I need your help with this. And then you have these meetings once in a while. Nobody ever said, I'm not available. I think that the faculty want to give back to you and to the early stage investigators, because, we've all been there. So I feel that maybe securing, it's not the great answer to your question, but securing funding is going to be difficult there, with recognition that will be optimal, but I'm not sure this is always going to be. So there are maybe other means to secure this network of managers.
I think it's very case by case. Some departments do have endowment. Some department chairs have discretionary fund. So you can speak with your leadership, whether they put this in the priority. You can carve out a small percentage of the fund from the department endowment to support that. And so that's the conversation between you and your department chair.
Yeah, and without speaking for our department, I mean, psychiatry's been having a conversation recently, because not only is mentorship typically not paid for, it sometimes costs mentors, right? So in above and beyond research and lab space and such. So particularly in psychology mentorship, there are training consortium fees for postdocs and pre-docs that come from the mentors that mentees don't really know about, right? They sort of show up and do their thing, but don't realize that we're paying a fee to have them. So the department, I think, has been working on finding ways to make the act of mentorship not something that's solely dependent on the wealth of the PI's sort of lab, so that PIs that have less resources can have that fee figured out so that they can still be mentors, because they still have value to add. So actually subtracting the negative is a value added in some of those contexts. But the COBRE mechanism of funding mentors is incredible. And as others have said, I think relatively great.
I think the only thing that I would add to all the things that have already been said is that there may be some foundations that provide, pilot or mentored projects that provide a small percentage. I can think of one that I don't want to say because I can't remember, but I think that the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention might have like a mentorship grant mechanism where the mentor gets a small percentage of effort. So small foundation grants might be another option.
So I think I just want to add this mentorship from a leadership point of view as a department chair. If you look far enough for the return, then you would want to invest. So that's back to my point. Does this candidate have a firm commitment from the department for the career development? If that condition met, as a mentor, I have much easier time to have a conversation with the department chair because the leadership sees the return in a few years down the road. So in that case, I may like to have some support.
Right, and staying in academia too, a member of promotions committees that have been on, that is looked at. Reviewed for promotion is have you been mentoring and how successful your mentees have been? Yes.
Yes, my name is Karen Jennings Mathis. I'm part of Star COBRES. And my question pertains to what I've heard thus far on the panel around mentorship and mentee. And it seems as though a lot of the conversation is centered around graduate students or postdocs. And my question would be, how do you, if at all, navigate mentorship across levels of education outside of the terminal degree postdoc? Research has suggested that you need to start earlier in the pipeline. And so are you providing mentorship in some capacity to your undergraduate students or even earlier to your local high schoolers, et cetera? And if so, how do you manage that? And how do you say yes? When do you say no? Or are you not doing that at all and why?
All of the above. I mean, so we get a lot of requests from high school students. The hospital stands in our way of bringing them into the lab in many capacities, and there's IRD issues and other things like that. But I do a lot of, it's hard to say yes to everything you get, but you get a lot of these things of, can I interview for my senior project? Or can I talk to you about this research topic? And those can be really rewarding if you say yes to them sparingly, because there's a lot of students and they look up Brown and they look up faculty and you get a lot of emails. But if you do some of those and you get those students excited about science, you're planting that seed very early and right, and you're exposing them to what science and academics look like. We get undergrads at every level, kids who volunteer in the lab and have very little responsibility up to honors thesis students, and spending a lot of time thinking about, how can we help them get to where they go, but recognizing that the earlier in your career stage, the less rigid you are in your goals, right? So they might think that your science is the coolest thing in the world on September 15th, and by December 10th are completely checked out. And you have to be okay with that at some level. And recognizing that if you get a really good undergrad, that's a reward, but that's not the expectation, right? Your job is there to expose them to the lab and give them some opportunities, and you might not see them after the first semester. So being flexible again is helpful in that. But it's really rewarding because if you get the really good ones and the ones that really like what they're doing with you, they'll stick around for a few years. They'll contribute to abstract papers and manuscripts and help you code data. Yeah.
There's a Summer at Brown program for high school students to take have the college experience, and I've taught it for the past 7 or so years. And I love high school students. They're so much fun. They're difficult in their own way, but it's been really fun to be doing my kind of day-to-day job here in psychiatry at Brown, where I'm working with faculty level, postdoc level, and then every summer I work with the high school students. And the difference is huge. And it's always a good reminder of where we all came from at one point in time. And they have all kinds of questions that kind of remind me of, gosh, it's very different when you're 16, 17 years old thinking about your future. And I recently got an email from one of my students from a couple years ago, and she is looking to go to graduate school, and she wanted to volunteer in a lab for part of the summer. So one of my students actually came into our lab for the summer and did some data coding. So I think it's really rewarding to work with people across levels, and I do think it's really important to kind of meet people, meet students, meet, all levels. Yeah.
If opportunity arises, then I would take, but, I engage in the, Leadership Alliance program. So each summer they send students from, less competitive colleges and, universities to our place to learn. Sometimes it's a mutual education to know their background. It's very educational for me. And then many years later, when they write you an email, they show a picture of them standing in front of a poster in a conference, rewarding, so that you have contributed to their success, especially when they come from a neighborhood. One of them wrote that most of the youth in their neighborhood have a few years in jail. It's almost standard trajectory for them. And then when he became 30 years old, had his own child, you realize that life doesn't go on like this. So he changed his trajectory and applied for this internship in my lab. So we learned from each other. And then he went on to have a very good career. So that's very rewarding. So if you have this opportunity to mutually enrich each other, I definitely would.
So if I may just add to this, is that I also engaged the postdocs, graduate students in the same kind of, so that in the mentor. So you not only mentor yourself, but you kind of prepare others also for this mentoring role. So there is, for example, for high school, there's this Mentor 100 program that graduate students from my lab, they go and they meet them at the school. There are some, some experiments, some small experiments, and the ones that are most interested, sometimes we kind of on board for the summers. For Leadership Alliance, it's another program. It's it's a really great program. I feel that I've been also involved for many years. It's a program to help underrepresented groups in science. But I feel that it is expected in my lab that everybody, at some point, if they, once they are ready, you want to match them as soon as possible. But when they are ready, you see that they are going strong with the project, and then they have time to maybe work with the mentee. Then it's expected that they will develop a relationship. And I will tell you this: that Olin was saying, this is how you learn how to mentor. This type of questions. This was absolutely incredible learning experience for me, and also then of course teaching others right now how to mentor, what works, what doesn't. And I will tell you that I've learned that your time is absolutely like the most precious thing that you can give them. That's
thank you. Okay. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you to the panelists, and again, thanks to our administrators for putting this together, Julie, Susan, Crystal, Tricia, Caitlin, Maggie. We really appreciate your efforts in putting this program together. We are going to adjourn, and there's lunch in the foyer, and then we'd ask you to bring it back in here, and we're going to do a networking session for those in the program. Okay, so just grab lunch and bring it back in, and we'll get started with that in a few minutes.